My brother slid the thick stack of estate papers across the polished oak table and smiled like he was doing me the ultimate favor. "Just sign it, Hannah," he said, his voice dripping with practiced sympathy. "Mom wanted this handled quietly, and I want to protect you." He slid a cashier's check for $50,000 next to the documents. It felt like a lifeline. But then my phone vibrated in my pocket. My accountant texted exactly 2 words that saved my entire life. "Do not sign." The hidden clause he found exposed my brother's perfect lie. Before I tell you what happened next, if you enjoy stories about justice and family boundaries, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Drop a comment and let me know. The air in the law office was freezing. It was exactly 48 hours after we lowered my mother Susan into the ground. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, a gray Philadelphia rain washed over the city. Inside, the mahogany conference room felt like a tomb. I was 32 years old, a public high school history teacher, and I was so exhausted my bones physically ached. For the past 2 years, I had been my mother's sole caregiver. I was the one who changed her sheets in the middle of the night. I was the one who blended her meals when she could no longer swallow solid food. I was the one who held her fragile, paper-thin hand while she took her last breath. Across the massive table sat my older brother Bradley and his wife Chloe. Bradley was 38, the vice president of a flashy real estate investment firm, and he looked like he had just stepped out of a magazine shoot. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit. His skin held a healthy, expensive tan, probably from the ski trip to Aspen he had taken while our mother was in her final weeks of hospice. Chloe sat next to him wearing a pristine white cashmere sweater and a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the harsh overhead lights. She smelled of bergamot and wealth. I sat opposite them in a dark dress I had bought on clearance 5 years ago, smelling faintly of hospital antiseptic and stale coffee. I just wanted to go home and sleep. I wanted to crawl into my bed and mourn my mother. Bradley knew this. He was counting on it. Hannah, my brother, began folding his manicured hands on the table. His voice was soft, reasonable, the tone of a man managing a crisis. "I know how hard these last few years have been for you. You did a good job being there for Mom, but we need to face reality now. The estate is a disaster." He pulled a glossy, heavily bound financial report from his leather briefcase and dropped it onto the table. It landed with a heavy, terrifying thud. According to Bradley, our mother had died completely broke. Worse than broke, actually. He pointed to a spreadsheet filled with red ink and negative numbers. He claimed that the out-of-pocket medical expenses, the in-home nursing care, and a series of bad investments our mother made before her mind went had completely drained her accounts. The house in the mainline suburbs, the house I grew up in and had practically lived in for the last 2 years, caring for her was supposedly buried under a mountain of hidden liens and a massive reverse mortgage. I looked at the numbers blurring together on the page. "How is this possible?" I asked. My voice sounded small, raspy from crying. Mom had a pension. She had savings. She was always so careful. Bradley sighed heavily, rubbing the bridge of his nose like he carried the weight of the world. "She hid it from us, Hannah. People get desperate when they get sick. The medical bills alone from the last 6 months ate through everything. The estate is currently sitting on nearly $800,000 in debt. The creditors are already circling. If we drag this through a long probate process, they will come after whatever meager assets are left, and they might even try to attach our personal accounts." Chloe reached across the table and placed her perfectly manicured hand over mine. I flinched internally, but did not pull away. "Oh, Hannah," she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "We know you do not have the resources to fight this. Teachers make, $50,000 a year. You simply cannot afford to get tangled up in federal tax liens and creditor lawsuits. It would ruin you." I stared at her. My chest felt tight. A deep, cold panic began to spread through my veins. The thought of aggressive creditors, of losing my modest apartment, of spending years in court battling over my mother's medical debts was paralyzing. I had nothing left to give. My savings were entirely depleted from taking unpaid leave to stay by my mother's bedside. I was running on empty, emotionally and financially. Bradley saw the fear in my eyes. He leaned forward, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper playing the ultimate protector. "I am not going to let them ruin you, Hannah. I am your big brother. I am going to shield you from this mess." He slid a thick stapled legal document across the oak table toward me. The title at the top read, Waiver of Co-Inheritance and Execution of Will. Before I could even read the first paragraph, he slid something else right next to it. A cashier's check. My name was printed on the front. The amount was $50,000. What is this? I asked, my eyes darting between the document and the check. It is your way out, Bradley said smoothly. If you sign this waiver, you legally remove yourself from the estate. You surrender any claim to the assets, but more importantly, you completely sever yourself from the liabilities. You walk away clean. I will take on the role of sole executor. I have the corporate lawyers, the financial backing, and the real estate connections to battle these creditors and liquidate the house to pay off the debts. I will take the hit for the family. And this check, that is out of my own personal savings. I know you sacrificed your teaching salary to help Mom. I want you to have this to get back on your feet. Consider it a gift. I looked at the check. $50,000. To a public school teacher drowning in credit card debt from buying groceries and medical supplies. It was a staggering amount of money. It was security. It was a fresh start. And all I had to do was sign my name and walk away from the nightmare of my mother's ruined estate. A wave of profound guilt washed over me. For years I had harbored resentment toward Bradley. I had judged him for abandoning our mother, for choosing his luxury vacations and country club dinners over helping me change her oxygen tanks. I had thought he was selfish and cold. Yet here he was offering to dive into a legal war zone with creditors just to protect me, handing me tens of thousands of dollars from his own pocket out of the goodness of his heart. I felt ashamed for ever doubting him. You do not have to do this, Bradley, I whispered, reaching out to touch the edge of the check. I can help you figure it out. I can take half the debt. No. Bradley insisted, firmly pushing a heavy silver Mont Blanc pen across the table toward my hand. I insist. Mom would have wanted you to be safe. She would have wanted me to handle the hard business. Just sign the waiver on the last page, and you can go home. You can finally rest, Hannah. Just rest. Rest. The words sounded like a holy promise. I picked up the heavy pen. The silver metal was cool against my skin. I flipped through the thick stack of dense legal jargon. Pages and pages of statutes, indemnification clauses, and property transfer terminology that I did not understand. But I did not need to understand it. My brother was handling it. I turned to the final page where a yellow sticky note pointed to a blank signature line. I positioned the tip of the pen over the paper. I was one stroke away from throwing my life away. Then my phone vibrated violently against my leg. It buzzed once, then again, then a third time in rapid, frantic succession. I froze. Bradley's eyes flicked to my pocket, a microscopic flash of irritation breaking through his calm facade. Do you need to get that? He asked quickly. It is probably just condolences. You can check it after we finish here. Just a second, I said, setting the pen down. An hour before this meeting started, while Bradley was out in the lobby, charming the receptionist and getting a cup of espresso. I had been sitting alone in the conference room with his open briefcase on the table. He had left the preliminary estate documents sitting right on top. I did not suspect him of anything nefarious at the time. I was just a nervous, exhausted teacher who wanted to make sure she understood what was happening. I had quickly snapped a few clear photos of the document summaries with my phone and sent them to David. David was not just my best friend. He was a brilliant senior accountant at a major firm in the city. He had handled my taxes for years. I had sent him the pictures with a quick text saying Bradley was handling the estate because Mom had debt, and I just wanted David to translate the legal jargon for me later. I pulled my phone from my pocket and looked at the glowing screen. David had sent 4 messages in a row. The first one read, "Do not sign anything." The second read, "Hannah, I mean it. Do not put your name on that paper." The third read, "That is not a waiver of debt." The fourth message was a long block of text. I read it under the table, my heart hammering against my ribs so loudly I thought Bradley could hear it. David wrote, "I just read the clauses in those photos. Bradley is lying to you. Your mother is not in debt. That document is a trap. It is a full transfer of all hidden assets directly to him. If you sign that, you are legally authorizing him to take sole ownership of the house and all the investment accounts. But worse, there is a poison pill hidden in Section 4. It makes you a co-guarantor for his business activities. If he gets investigated for fraud, you are legally on the hook for 50% of the liability. He is trying to use you as a human shield. Do not sign it. Get out of that room." I read the text twice. My brain struggled to process the words: transfer of hidden assets, poison pill, human shield. I looked up from the screen. Bradley was watching me intensely. His posture was still relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, calculating, completely devoid of the brotherly warmth he had been projecting 5 minutes ago. Chloe was leaning forward, her lips pressed into a tight, anxious line. "Is everything all right?" Bradley asked, his voice a little too loud, a little too strained. The exhaustion that had weighed me down for 2 years vanished instantly. It was replaced by a surge of pure, freezing adrenaline. The guilt I had felt for judging him evaporated, replaced by a profound, horrifying realization. My brother was not protecting me. He was robbing me blind and trying to frame me for his own financial crimes. He had waited until our mother was in the ground, waited until I was practically dead on my feet to slide this trap across the table. He bought my trust with a $50,000 check that was probably drawn from my own stolen inheritance. I looked at the silver pen resting on the table. Then I looked at the $50,000 check. Then I looked at my brother, the man who shared my blood, the man who had stood beside me at our mother's grave just 48 hours ago pretending to weep. He was a predator, and I had almost walked willingly into his jaws. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. I took a deep, steadying breath, fighting the urge to scream, fighting the urge to flip the heavy oak table directly into his lap. I needed to get out of this room. I needed to get to David. But if I let Bradley know that I knew the truth, he would destroy the evidence. I had to be smart. I had to play the only card I had left. I let out a long, shaky sigh and pressed my hand to my chest, forcing my breathing to become shallow and rapid. I let my eyes widen in manufactured panic. Hannah, Chloe asked, stepping back in her chair. "I am so sorry," I gasped, standing up abruptly. My chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. "I cannot breathe. I think I am having a panic attack. I just need a minute. I need to go to the restroom and splash water on my face." Bradley stood up instantly, his mask slipping. His voice turned hard, demanding. "Hannah, just sign the paper first. It takes 2 seconds. Then you can go rest. I cannot focus." I choked out, backing away from the table, leaving the pen and the check untouched. "I just need 1 minute. I will be right back." Before he could reach around the table to stop me, I turned and practically ran out of the cold oak meeting room, leaving my brother and his perfect lie behind. The real fight had just begun. The heavy oak doors of the conference room clicked shut behind me, severing the suffocating silence of that room like a blade. I leaned my back against the cool corridor wall and let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for my entire life. My hands were shaking so violently that I had to press them flat against my thighs to make them stop. The plush carpet beneath my feet seemed to tilt. The reality of what had just happened, of what I had almost done, crashed over me with the force of a physical blow. My own brother, the man who had stood beside me 48 hours ago, as we buried our mother. He had just tried to trick me into signing away my inheritance and taking on the liability for his financial crimes. I pushed myself off the wall and began to walk fast. My sensible black flats made no sound on the thick carpeting of the law firm, but the blood was roaring in my ears so loudly it drowned out everything else. I practically ran toward the elevators at the end of the long hallway. I hit the down button repeatedly, my palms slick with nervous sweat against the glowing metal. The digital numbers above the stainless steel doors seemed to drop in excruciating slow motion. 10. 9. I kept glancing over my shoulder, staring back down the empty corridor, expecting the conference room doors to swing open at any second. I knew Bradley better than anyone. He was not a patient man. He was a man who demanded absolute control over every situation, every deal, and every person in his orbit. And I had just walked away from his carefully constructed trap without giving him the signature he desperately needed. The elevator finally chimed a cheerful, polite sound that felt completely out of place in my nightmare. The door slid apart, and I threw myself inside, slamming my hand against the lobby button. As the doors closed, sealing me in the mirrored box, I caught sight of my own reflection. I looked pale, exhausted, and utterly drained. I had spent the last 2 years of my life sleeping on a small cot in my mother's bedroom, waking up every 2 hours to adjust her oxygen, pureeing her food, tracking her medications, and holding her hand while she forgot who I was. I had sacrificed my savings, my social life, and my mental health to care for the woman who gave us life. And while I was doing that, Bradley was orchestrating a massive, elaborate scheme to steal whatever she had left and leave me holding the bag. The elevator descended, and the panic that had been gripping my chest began to harden into something else. The fear was burning away, leaving behind a cold, sharp, undeniable fury. He thought I was stupid. He thought because I was a public high school history teacher who drove an old car and wore clearance rack clothes, I would simply bow my head and take his $50,000 bribe. He thought I would be so terrified of the fake debt he presented that I would blindly sign a document making me his human shield. The doors parted at the ground floor. I sprinted through the opulent marble lobby of the law firm, ignoring the curious looks from the receptionists and the security guards. I pushed my way through the heavy glass revolving doors and stepped out into the freezing Philadelphia rain. The cold water hit my face instantly, soaking my hair and my dark dress, but I welcomed it. It shocked my system. It cleared the fog of grief from my mind. I was not going to be his victim. I jogged across the wet asphalt of the visitor parking lot toward my car. My vehicle was a 12-year-old Honda Civic with a dented rear bumper and fading paint. It looked completely pathetic, parked next to the sleek black SUVs and luxury sedans that filled the spaces around it. I fumbled in my purse for my keys, my fingers digging through old receipts and loose pens. The rain was coming down in sheets, now blurring my vision. I finally gripped the metal key and shoved it into the lock of the driver's side door. I pulled the handle, ready to slide into the safety of my car, lock the doors, and drive straight to David. Before I could pull the door open, a heavy hand slammed flat against the wet glass of my window. The force of the blow made me jump backward. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Bradley was standing there. He was breathing heavily, his expensive navy suit completely soaked by the pouring rain. His perfectly styled hair was plastered to his forehead. He had chased me all the way down from the 47th floor. The benevolent, caring older brother mask he had been wearing in the conference room was entirely gone. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. His eyes, usually so calm and calculating, were dark and wild. "Where do you think you are going?" Hannah Bradley asked. His voice was no longer soft or sympathetic. It was a low, menacing growl that cut through the sound of the falling rain. The kind of voice he used when he was crushing someone in a hostile corporate takeover. I took a step back, my back pressing against the wet metal of my car door. "I needed some air," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I told you I was having a panic attack. I am going home. We can talk about the estate later." "We are going to talk about it right now," he snapped, stepping closer. He planted his hand on the roof of my car, effectively caging me between his body and the vehicle. He smelled of expensive cologne and angry sweat. "You are going to march back up to that conference room and you are going to sign that waiver. We are not playing games today." "I am not signing anything today, Bradley," I said, forcing myself to look him directly in the eye. "I am too exhausted to read legal documents. I need to have a lawyer look over them first." The moment the word lawyer left my mouth, something dark and dangerous flashed in his expression. The muscle in his jaw twitched. "You do not need a lawyer," he said, his voice dropping into a vicious, mocking sneer. "You need to listen to me. I am handing you $50,000 on a silver platter. I am offering to save you from a disaster. Do you have any idea what kind of mess Mom left behind? Do you have any idea what creditors will do to you?" I stared at him, the rain soaking through my thin dress, chilling me to the bone. But I was not cold from the weather. I was cold because I was looking at a sociopath. He was standing there in the rain, lying straight to my face about the mother we had just buried. He was using her death as a weapon against me. "I think I will take my chances," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but laced with a new dangerous resolve. "Move out of my way, Bradley. I am leaving." I reached for the door handle again, but he forcefully grabbed my wrist. His grip was tight, his fingers digging into my skin. I gasped in pain and tried to pull away, but he held me firmly against the car. "Listen to me, you pathetic, ungrateful little girl," he hissed, leaning in so close I could feel the heat of his breath on my wet face. "You think you are smart. You think you can walk away from this. If you do not walk back upstairs and sign that document right now, I will destroy you. I will use my legal team to bury you so deep in litigation, you will never see daylight again." I struggled against his grip, but he was much stronger than I was. "Let go of me," I yelled, looking around the parking lot. It was empty. The rain was too heavy. No one was coming to help me. "You want to fight me?" He laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. "With what resources, Hannah? You make $50,000 a year teaching history to teenagers. You have zero savings. You have nothing. My lawyers cost more in one afternoon than you make in an entire decade. I will tie this estate up in probate court for the next 10 years. I will make sure the court assigns every single penny of Mom's medical debt directly to you. I will have your miserable little teacher's salary garnished until you are living on the street." He shoved me backward slightly, emphasizing his power. "You spent 2 years wiping Mom's chin and giving up your life for nothing. You think anyone cares. You think the court cares that you were a good daughter. They do not. The law only cares about paper, and I have the paper. I have the power. If you cross me, I will take your apartment, I will take your car, and I will leave you bankrupt. I am giving you a gift. Take the $50,000 and disappear, or I will make sure you inherit millions of dollars in medical debt." The sheer audacity of his threat took my breath away. He was not just trying to steal from me, he was trying to financially ruin me if I dared to stand in his way. He wanted me broken. He wanted me compliant. He was looking at me the way he looked at an underperforming asset that needed to be liquidated. I was not his sister. I was an obstacle. But he had made one critical miscalculation. He thought my 2 years of caregiving had made me weak. He thought exhaustion had made me stupid. He did not realize that watching our mother slowly die had stripped away every single illusion I had left about our family. I had already survived the worst pain imaginable. His threats of bankruptcy and lawyers meant absolutely nothing compared to the agony of listening to my mother forget my name. He could not break me because I had already been broken and rebuilt into something much harder. I stopped struggling. I went completely still. I looked at his hand wrapped tightly around my wrist, leaving angry red marks on my pale skin. Then I looked up into his furious, arrogant eyes. "Take your hand off me," I said. My voice did not shake. It did not waver. It was dead calm, possessing a terrifying clarity that made him blink in surprise. I said, "Take your hand off me, Bradley, before I start screaming and security comes out here to see the vice president of Sterling Investments assaulting a woman in the parking lot." He hesitated. For a split second, I saw a flicker of doubt cross his face. He cared about his reputation more than anything else in the world. Slowly, reluctantly, he uncurled his fingers and let go of my wrist. I rubbed the sore skin, never breaking eye contact with him. "You are making the biggest mistake of your miserable life," he sneered, taking a step back but keeping his body angled to block my path. "You will regret this, Hannah. I promise you that. When the collection agencies come knocking on your door, do not come crying to me." "I will not," I replied smoothly. I grabbed the handle of my car door and pulled it open. The interior of my old Honda smelled like vanilla and damp floor mats. It felt like a sanctuary. I slid into the driver's seat and pulled the door shut. Bradley immediately stepped forward, grabbing the top of the door frame, preventing me from closing it completely. He leaned his head down, his face appearing in the gap between the door and the frame. The rain was dripping from his nose. "I will give you 24 hours to come to your senses," he said, his voice a dark promise. "After that, the gloves come off. You sign the waiver, or I burn your life to the ground." I looked at him, feeling a sudden strange sense of pity for the monster he had become. "Do whatever you have to do, Bradley," I said quietly. I grabbed the interior handle and yanked the door shut with all my strength. It slammed loudly, forcing him to snatch his fingers back, just in time to avoid getting them crushed. I immediately hit the power lock button. The satisfying clunk of the locks engaging echoed in the small cabin. Bradley stood outside in the pouring rain, staring at me through the wet glass. He slammed his fist against my window one last time, cursing loudly, his face contorted in anger. I ignored him. I shoved my key into the ignition and twisted it. The engine sputtered for a second, a terrifying hesitation before roaring to life. I threw the car into reverse and hit the gas. The tires squealed against the wet asphalt, kicking up a spray of dirty water that splashed directly onto Bradley's expensive trousers. I shifted into drive and peeled out of the visitor parking lot, leaving my brother standing alone in the storm. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I turned the heater on full blast, shivering uncontrollably in my soaked clothes, but I did not cry. I had shed all my tears over my mother's grave. I had none left for the brother who was trying to destroy me. As I merged onto the busy Philadelphia streets, navigating through the heavy gray downpour and the chaotic city traffic, the reality of my situation settled over me like a heavy blanket. Bradley was not bluffing. He had the money, the influence, and the sheer ruthlessness to follow through on his threats. He would hire the most aggressive attorneys in the state to bury me in paperwork. He would manipulate the probate courts. He would do everything in his power to frame me for the financial disaster he had secretly created. David's text message flashed in my mind again. Transfer of hidden assets, poison pill. Bradley was trying to steal something massive, and he needed me to take the fall for it. The only way to stop him, the only way to protect myself from being financially ruined and potentially facing federal charges for his crimes, was to prove that his entire narrative was a lie. I had to prove that our mother did not die bankrupt. I had to uncover exactly how much money she really had, where it was hidden, and what Bradley had done to it. I needed evidence, and I needed it before Bradley could destroy it. I hit the blinker and changed lanes, heading directly toward the commercial district where David's accounting firm was located. The fear was completely gone now, replaced by a singular burning focus. My brother thought I was just a naive, exhausted public school teacher who would surrender at the first sign of a fight. He thought I was weak. He was about to find out exactly how wrong he was. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, driving faster into the storm, ready to uncover the truth. The drive from David's office to the main line took 45 minutes, but my mind was spinning so fast it felt like hours. The windshield wipers on my 12-year-old Honda beat a frantic, rhythmic thud against the heavy Philadelphia rain. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white, and my joints ached with a dull, throbbing pain. I was driving toward the only place that might hold the truth. I was heading to my mother's house. It was located in the heart of the main line, an affluent string of historical suburbs where manicured lawns, towering oak trees, and massive stone mansions projected a permanent image of perfect, untouchable wealth. It was the house I grew up in, and for the last 2 years, it had been my entire suffocating world. When I finally turned onto the familiar tree-lined street, the sheer size of the neighboring estates felt heavier and more oppressive than the rain clouds above. Bradley belonged in this world of pristine landscaping and luxury cars. I did not. I parked my old sedan a full block away, instinctively hiding it behind a large row of privacy hedges, just like I always used to do when my mother hosted her high society charity dinners. The freezing rain soaked instantly through my dark clearance rack dress as I walked down the long curving driveway toward the property. The house stood silent and dark. It was a massive brick colonial structure, looking cold and imposing against the dreary gray sky. I reached into my purse with shivering fingers and pulled out my brass key. My hand shook violently as I slid it into the heavy front door lock. The mechanism clicked with a loud echoing sound that made me jump, and I pushed the heavy wooden door open. Stepping into the grand foyer felt like walking directly into a mausoleum. The air inside was completely stale, carrying the faint, lingering scent of expensive lavender room spray, mixed with the harsh, undeniable chemical tang of medical antiseptic. I closed the door very quietly behind me and stood in the dim shadows, letting my eyes adjust to the gloom. The absolute silence in the house was deafening. Just 48 hours ago, this very place had been filled with the chaotic, terrifying sounds of a life coming to its end. The rhythmic, mechanical hissing of the oxygen concentrator, the frantic, high-pitched beeping of the heart rate monitor, the soft, agonizing sounds my mother made when her pain medication wore off in the middle of the night. Now there was nothing but the sound of the rain beating against the expensive window panes. I walked slowly past the formal dining room, ignoring the long mahogany table where we used to have tense holiday dinners, and stepped into the main living space. My chest tightened so hard I could barely pull air into my lungs. The hospital bed we had rented for her was still right there, sitting awkwardly in the center of the beautiful room next to the expensive cream-colored leather sofas. The sheets had been stripped bare, leaving only the sterile blue plastic mattress. Seeing that empty bed hit me like a physical punch to the stomach. I walked over to it and placed my hand on the cold metal safety rail. For 24 agonizing months, this small corner of the house had been my absolute reality. I had put every single aspect of my life completely on hold. I took an extended unpaid leave of absence from my teaching job at the public high school, sacrificing my career progression and my peace of mind. I systematically drained every single cent of my meager savings account just to buy groceries, cover the endless pharmacy copays, and keep the utility bills from going to collections. I spent my nights sleeping on a small, incredibly uncomfortable folding cot positioned right next to this medical bed. I woke up every 2 hours exhausted and weeping just to turn her frail body over so she would not develop painful bed sores. I carefully blended her meals into liquid, sitting for hours, spoon-feeding her when she became too weak to lift her own arms. I bathed her with warm sponges. I held her hair back when the strong medications made her violently ill. I watched the proud, stubborn woman who raised me slowly fade away into a shadow piece by agonizing piece. And where was my brother Bradley during those 2 grueling years? My grip tightened on the cold metal rail as the memory of his complete and total abandonment fueled a fresh wave of burning anger. While I was scrubbing soiled sheets in the laundry room at 3 in the morning, Bradley was living his absolute best life. I remembered one specific terrifying night last January. My mother had developed a sudden severe fever that spiked to dangerous levels. I was terrified, sitting beside her with a cold washcloth, frantically texting Bradley to ask if he could come over and help me make a decision about calling an ambulance. He did not reply for 4 hours. When he finally did respond, it was a short, dismissive message saying he was tied up with a massive $1 million commercial project and simply could not get away to help. The very next morning, I opened social media and saw Chloe's public posts. They were not busy with a real estate project. They were in Aspen. There were high-resolution photos of Bradley holding a crystal glass of champagne in a luxury ski lodge, his face tanned and perfectly relaxed, wearing a designer ski jacket that cost more than my monthly rent. The caption under the photo read, "Under Terschwartki, Terchthier, weekend getaway with my amazing husband." He was drinking expensive champagne while I was sitting in the dark, counting the seconds between our mother's ragged, struggling breaths. Whenever I begged him for physical help or financial support, he always had a perfectly crafted excuse ready. The housing market was tough. His investment firm was undergoing a stressful restructuring. He was in the middle of closing a complicated deal that would eventually secure the entire family's future. It was always a lie. He left me to carry the heavy, crushing burden entirely alone, and then he swooped in the exact moment her heart stopped beating to claim the ultimate prize and leave me with nothing but fabricated debt. I forced myself to pull my hand away from the empty medical bed. I was not here to drown in my grief and my memories. I was here to find the absolute truth. David had warned me that Bradley's waiver document was a sophisticated legal trap designed to transfer all hidden assets to his name and make me fully liable for his financial crimes. That meant there were actual assets out there to hide. My mother was not bankrupt. She was a meticulous old-school woman who kept precise records of absolutely everything. She did not fully trust modern digital banking or cloud storage. She kept physical ledgers. She used thick, leather-bound accounting books where she personally tracked every single penny that came into her possession and every penny that went out. If Bradley was trying to fake a massive mountain of medical debt, those physical ledgers would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was lying. I turned away from the living room and made my way down the long hallway toward the back of the house, heading straight for her private home office. The hardwood floorboards creaked loudly under my wet shoes. The house felt entirely too big and completely empty. I reached the heavy oak door to the office, pushed it open, and reached out to flip on the brass desk lamp. The room was a complete disaster. My mother was a strict perfectionist who demanded total order in her workspace, but the office currently looked like a violent hurricane had swept directly through it. The drawers of the filing cabinets were pulled completely open, their contents violently shoved aside. Confidential papers were scattered haphazardly across the expensive Persian rug. Heavy hardcover books had been knocked off the mahogany shelves and left lying open on the floor. Someone had already been here. Someone had been searching frantically through her belongings. Bradley. My heart began to hammer wildly in my throat. He must have come here straight from the hospital immediately after she died, maybe even while I was sitting in the funeral home finalizing the burial arrangements. I moved quickly to the massive desk in the center of the room. I dropped to my knees on the floor and started pulling out the bottom storage drawers. I found empty file folders. I found stacks of old greeting cards and useless utility bills from 10 years ago. Nothing of value. I checked the tall bookshelves, pulling out thick encyclopedias and heavy old photo albums, desperately hoping she had hidden the ledgers somewhere behind them. Nothing. Think, Hannah, I whispered out loud to the empty room, trying to calm my racing mind. Where would she put the most important financial documents of her entire life? I stood up and looked frantically around the disorganized room. My eyes finally landed on the large ornate oil painting hanging on the far wall behind the desk. It was a beautiful, expansive landscape of the Pennsylvania countryside, a very expensive piece my father had bought for her decades ago before he passed away. It looked slightly crooked. It was hanging just a fraction of an inch lower on the left side. I walked slowly over to the painting. My hands were trembling violently as I reached out and gently pushed the heavy gilded frame to the right. The painting swung open smoothly on a hidden set of hinges. Behind the canvas was a steel wall safe. A massive surge of hope rushed through my entire body. This was it. This was the answer. This was exactly where she kept her true financial records, her bearer bonds, and the real version of her will. This was the solid proof I needed to save myself from ruin and send my treacherous brother to federal prison. I reached out to touch the digital keypad, closing my eyes and trying to remember the 4-digit combination she had used for her old home security system. But as my fingertips brushed the cold metal, the warm hope vanished instantly, replaced by a freezing, sinking dread that settled heavy in my stomach. I did not need to remember the combination. The safe was already open. The heavy steel door was resting slightly ajar. I looked closer and felt my blood run cold. The digital lock panel had been brutally and violently smashed. The black plastic casing was cracked into jagged pieces, and colorful wires were hanging out of the mechanism like dead veins. Someone had taken a very heavy tool to it, bashing the keypad repeatedly until the internal locking mechanism simply gave way. I grabbed the metal handle and pulled the heavy steel door wide open. The interior of the safe was completely empty. There were no leather-bound ledgers. There were no bank statements. There were no hidden assets or legal documents. The gray metal interior was scraped and scratched completely and entirely cleaned out. I stumbled backward, my hand flying up to cover my mouth. He beat me to it. Bradley had already taken absolutely everything. He had violently looted his own mother's safe while her body was barely cold in the hospital morgue. The horrific realization hit me with terrifying, undeniable clarity. He had the money. He had the authentic records. He had total and complete control over the legal narrative. And without those physical ledgers, I had absolutely no proof that the financial report he showed me in the conference room was a forgery. It would be my word against the vice president of a wealthy, highly respected investment firm. A poor, exhausted public high school teacher against a powerful man with a team of ruthless corporate lawyers. I felt a massive primal scream building deep in my throat. I had sacrificed 2 full years of my life to keep her comfortable. I had lost my mother. I was deeply, drowningly in debt. And now my own flesh and blood brother was going to destroy my entire future just to cover his tracks and line his own pockets. I dropped heavily to my knees on the Persian rug surrounded by the scattered, useless papers he had left behind. The profound exhaustion I had been fighting off all day finally crashed down on me, crushing my spirit. I put my face in my hands and let out a dry, ragged sob. I was completely trapped. Then a sudden, violent sound cut through the heavy silence of the empty house. It was the sharp, piercing screech of car tires braking hard on the wet asphalt directly outside the front window. I froze instantly. My breath caught sharply in my lungs. I scrambled silently to my feet and ran to the front-facing window, pressing my back flat against the cold wall and peeking out carefully through the very edge of the heavy velvet curtains. A sleek black Lexus SUV was parked aggressively in the center of the circular driveway, the bright headlights cutting sharply through the gray rain and illuminating the front porch. The heavy car doors swung open simultaneously. Bradley and Chloe stepped out into the raging storm. Bradley looked absolutely furious. He was speaking rapidly and angrily into his cell phone, marching toward the front porch with long, aggressive strides. Chloe followed close behind him, struggling to hold a large umbrella over her head, her face twisted into a deep, ugly scowl. They had not stayed at the law firm to finish their paperwork. They had come straight here to the house. He knew exactly what I was doing. He knew I would try to find the evidence he had left behind. Panic, raw and blinding, seized my mind. I was completely trapped inside the house. My car was parked down the street, hidden behind the hedges, but they would definitely see me if I tried to run out the front door. The back door in the kitchen was locked with an old deadbolt that required a physical key from the inside, a key I did not have on my ring. I heard the heavy, metallic sound of a key sliding roughly into the front door lock. "I need to find her right now," Bradley's voice echoed from the grand foyer, loud and menacing in the empty house. "She is going to ruin everything if she talks to that accountant again. You check the upstairs bedrooms, I will check the study." Heavy footsteps began moving quickly across the hardwood floor, heading straight down the hallway toward the office where I was standing. I was completely out of time. The heavy footsteps pounding down the hardwood hallway stopped abruptly at the threshold of the home office. I stood completely frozen in the center of the room, surrounded by the chaotic mess of my mother's scattered papers and the gaping empty steel safe. The heavy oak door swung open wide, hitting the wall with a loud, violent crack that made me jump. Bradley stood in the doorway, his chest heaving under his wet, expensive navy suit. The rain dripped from his perfectly styled hair onto the Persian rug. The mask of the benevolent, grieving older brother was completely gone now. His face was twisted into a dark, ugly snarl of pure rage. Right behind him stepped his wife, Chloe. She stood tall in her pristine designer trench coat, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the glow of the desk lamp. She looked down her nose at me with an expression of absolute disgust, as if she had just found a stray animal tracking mud into a luxury hotel. "What exactly do you think you are doing in here?" Hannah, Bradley demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl that echoed off the mahogany bookshelves. I forced myself to stand up straight, pushing down the overwhelming wave of exhaustion and terror. "I am looking for Mom's financial ledgers," I replied, my voice remarkably steady, despite the frantic beating of my heart. "I am looking for the real documents, the ones that were inside that safe before you broke into it and emptied it out." Bradley let out a sharp, mocking laugh that held absolutely zero humor. He stepped fully into the room, blocking my only exit. "You are completely delusional," he said. "You are having a mental breakdown from the stress of the funeral. There are no secret ledgers. You saw the financial report in the conference room. Mom died with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. I am trying to save you from ruin, and instead of thanking me, you come here and vandalize her home." "Do not lie to me, Bradley," I shot back, pointing a trembling finger at the violently smashed digital keypad of the wall safe. "I know you did this. Mom never trusted digital banking. She kept physical records of every single penny she owned. David read the documents you tried to force me to sign. I know about the hidden asset transfer. I know about the poison pill clause that would make me liable for your financial crimes." The moment I mentioned David the accountant and the specific legal clauses, Bradley's eyes narrowed into dark, calculating slits. He realized his trap had completely failed. He could no longer play the protective savior. Chloe scoffed loudly, stepping out from behind her husband. She crossed her arms over her chest and shook her head with a patronizing smirk. "This is exactly why teachers never understand high-level finance." Chloe insulted me, her voice dripping with venom and elitist arrogance. "You spend all day handing out gold stars to teenagers, and you suddenly think you understand complex estate law and corporate asset management. You are completely out of your depth, Hannah. You have absolutely no idea how the real world works. You should have just taken the $50,000 check and gone back to your little public school classroom." I stared at her, feeling a hot flash of anger burn through my freezing wet clothes. I spent the last 2 years bathing my mother, feeding her and holding her hand, while you two took luxury ski vacations in Aspen. I said, my voice rising with righteous indignation. "Do not stand in my mother's house and lecture me about the real world." "It is not your mother's house anymore," Bradley stated coldly. His words hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The room seemed to spin. "What are you talking about?" I demanded. Bradley reached into his wetsuit jacket and pulled out his sleek smartphone. "I am the sole legal owner of this property," he said, a cruel, triumphant smile spreading across his face. He tapped the screen of his phone and held it up. I did not need to wait for the probate court to sort out the mess. Mom signed a full durable power of attorney over to me weeks ago. As her legal representative, I transferred the deed of this house entirely into my name and the name of my corporate holding company. It was a perfectly legal protective measure to shield the real estate from her aggressive medical creditors. I felt all the blood drain rapidly from my face. My mind flashed back to the last few months. My mother had been completely bedridden, heavily medicated on high doses of morphine, and slipping in and out of a deep coma. She could barely recognize my face, let alone comprehend or sign complex legal real estate documents. "You forged it!" I breathed, stepping back as the sheer magnitude of his evil washed over me. "You had a fake power of attorney drafted, and you transferred the deed to yourself while she was lying in a coma. That is fraud. That is elder abuse. Prove it." Bradley challenged, stepping closer to me, his tall frame completely dominating the small space. "You cannot prove a single thing. I have the signed documents. I have the highly paid corporate lawyers. I have the notary public on my payroll. All you have is a wild imagination and an empty bank account. And right now, you are trespassing on my private property." "I live here," I shouted, panic finally edging into my voice. "My name is on the utility bills. I have been living in this house 24 hours a day for 2 entire years to keep her alive while you ignored her." "Not anymore," Bradley replied smoothly. He lifted his phone to his ear. "Yes, operator. I need police assistance immediately at my private residence on the main line. I have an intruder in my home. Yes, it is my estranged sister. She's highly erratic, acting aggressively and refusing to leave my property. Please send officers right away." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. His eyes were cold and dead. "You have 5 minutes before the police arrive and drag you out of here in handcuffs, Hannah. I suggest you grab your purse and start walking." I stood my ground, my hands balled into tight fists at my sides. I was terrified. My entire body was shaking with cold and adrenaline. The thought of being arrested, of having a criminal record that would instantly destroy my teaching career and strip away my only source of income was paralyzing. But a deeper, stronger part of me absolutely refused to be bullied by the man who had abandoned our mother and stolen her legacy. I refused to run away like a frightened child. "I will wait for the police," I said, firmly staring him down. Chloe rolled her eyes and let out a dramatic sigh. "You're making a massive fool of yourself, Hannah. This is just embarrassing." The next 10 minutes felt like an eternity. The three of us stood in the ruined office in complete silence, the only sound coming from the heavy rain lashing against the window glass. I looked around the room, taking in the familiar sights of my childhood. The mahogany desk where my mother used to help me with my history projects. The tall bookshelves lined with her favorite classic novels. The deep green Persian rug where I used to sit and read for hours. This house held every good memory I had, and Bradley had tainted it all with his suffocating greed. Suddenly, the dark driveway outside was illuminated by flashing red and blue lights. The stark, unnatural colors swept wildly across the office walls, casting long moving shadows. 2 heavy knocks pounded on the front door. Bradley immediately smoothed his wet suit jacket, arranged his face into an expression of calm, distressed concern, and walked down the hallway to answer it. I heard the deep voices of the police officers entering the foyer. "Officers, thank you so much for coming quickly," Bradley said loudly, playing his role with sickening perfection. "I am Bradley, the homeowner. My mother recently passed away, and my sister is having a very severe mental breakdown. She broke into my house tonight, vandalized the office, and is refusing to vacate the premises. I just want her removed safely before she hurts herself or damages any more of my property." Heavy footsteps approached the office. 2 police officers stepped into the room, their rain gear dripping onto the floor. They took one look at the chaotic mess of papers, the violently smashed safe, and then focused their stern eyes directly on me. I was soaking wet, shivering in a cheap dress, looking completely disheveled and frantic. In contrast, Bradley and Chloe looked wealthy, successful, and perfectly composed. "Ma'am," one of the officers said, his voice firm and authoritative, as he rested his hand casually near his utility belt. "I need you to step away from the desk and keep your hands where I can see them. The homeowner has asked you to leave. You are currently trespassing." "I am not trespassing, officer," I said, forcing my voice to remain polite and absolutely calm. I know that as a public school teacher, any sign of hysteria would immediately validate Bradley's false narrative. This is my primary residence. I live here. I have lived here for 2 years as the sole caregiver for my mother, who just passed away. Bradley sighed heavily and shook his head, looking at the officers with manufactured pity. "She is confused, officers. She does not live here. She's just visiting for the funeral. I hold the sole deed to this property. It is entirely in my name. I can show you the digital copy of the title right now on my phone." He pulled out his phone and showed the screen to the nearest officer. The officer nodded slowly, his expression tightening as he turned back to me. Ma'am, he has legal documentation showing he's the property owner, the officer stated, taking a step toward me. If he asks you to leave, you have to leave. If you refuse to comply with a lawful order to vacate private property, I will have to place you in handcuffs and remove you by force. Do not make me do that tonight. My heart hammered against my ribs. The threat of the cold metal handcuffs was terrifyingly real. Bradley had outplayed me using fake paper, but I knew the law. I knew my rights as a resident. I slowly and deliberately reached into my wet purse, making sure the officers could see every movement clearly. I am just getting my identification, I said quietly. I pulled out my Pennsylvania driver's license and handed it directly to the speaking officer. Please look at the address, I instructed calmly. The officer took the plastic card and shone a small flashlight on it. He read the address. It perfectly matched the house we were standing in. He looked up, his brow furrowing in confusion. This is her permanent legal address on a state-issued ID card. I continued, my voice gaining strength. I receive all my federal mail here. My bank statements come here. My vehicle is registered to this exact address. Regardless of who currently holds a newly printed deed, I am a legally established tenant and a primary resident of this home. In the state of Pennsylvania, a property owner cannot execute an immediate forceful eviction of an established resident without providing a formal 30-day written notice and going through the legal court eviction process. It is an illegal self-help eviction to have me forcefully removed tonight without a court order. The officer lowered his flashlight and looked over at Bradley. The dynamic in the room shifted instantly. The police were no longer dealing with a random erratic intruder. They were dealing with a complex civil dispute regarding tenancy and property rights. Sir, the officer said, turning to my brother, does she receive mail here? Has she been staying here long term? Bradley's jaw clenched, the muscles in his neck strained. She was just staying in the guest room to help out temporarily, he argued, his voice losing its smooth polish. She is not a tenant. She pays no rent. That does not matter under state law, sir, the second officer chimed in, stepping forward. If her state ID matches this address, and she has established residency by living here for 2 years, she has tenant rights. We cannot legally force her out onto the street tonight without a court-ordered eviction warrant. That is a civil matter. Chloe let out an exasperated noise. Are you kidding me? She's a squatter in our house, and you are protecting her. We are following the law, ma'am, the officer replied firmly. He turned back to me, his expression much softer now, recognizing the grief and exhaustion hiding behind my wet clothes. Listen, miss, he said quietly, you have the legal right to stay here tonight. But given the extreme hostility of this situation and the fact that there is a severe legal dispute over the property deed and a smashed safe, I highly recommend you pack your immediate belongings and find somewhere safe to sleep. If you stay here tonight with them, things are only going to escalate. You need to take this to a judge tomorrow. I looked at the officer, then at my brother's furious red face. The officer was right. Staying in this isolated house overnight with a man who had just forged legal documents and stolen my mother's assets was incredibly dangerous. I had lost the battle for the house tonight, but the war was far from over. I needed to regroup, and I needed to survive. You are right, officer, I said, nodding slowly. I will leave voluntarily tonight to keep the peace, but I need to gather a few personal belongings from the living room first. I will escort you, the officer offered kindly. I walked out of the ruined office feeling the burning, hateful glares of Bradley and Chloe tracking my every move. I walked down the long hallway and back into the main living room. The empty medical bed sat there, a silent monument to my mother's suffering. I walked over to the tall wooden bookshelf that stood near the fireplace. Bradley and Chloe followed closely behind, flanked by the second officer. Make sure she does not take anything valuable, Chloe snapped, pointing a manicured finger at me. Everything in this house belongs to Bradley's company now. I ignored her entirely. My eyes scanned the shelves, looking past the expensive crystal vases, the silver picture frames, and the antique clock that Bradley would surely sell to the highest bidder. My gaze landed on the bottom shelf tucked away in a dusty, dark corner. It was my mother's old, worn-out Bible. It was a thick, heavy book bound in cracked black leather. The gold lettering on the spine had faded decades ago. The pages were dog-eared and soft from years of constant use. It was the only item in the entire house that held absolutely zero monetary value. It was the only thing Bradley and Chloe had looked right past when they were ransacking the property for cash and bonds. They worshipped money. They had no use for faith. I reached out and gently picked up the heavy book. "Put that down," Bradley demanded, instantly stepping forward. "You are not taking anything out of this house. It is just an old Bible." The escorting police officer intervened, putting a firm hand up to stop Bradley. "It has clear, sentimental value. Let the grieving daughter take her mother's Bible. It is not a financial asset." Bradley scoffed, loudly rolling his eyes in disgust. "Fine. Take the worthless book. Just get out of my house." I clutched the heavy leather Bible tightly against my chest. As I pressed it against my wet dress, my fingers gripping the worn spine, my heart suddenly skipped a massive, violent beat. Hidden deep inside the thick, hollowed-out lining of the old leather spine, I felt the distinct, unmistakable shape of a hard, rigid piece of metal. It was a long, jagged key, a bank safe deposit box key. I kept my face completely blank. I did not gasp. I did not smile. I did not let a single ounce of the triumphant shock register in my eyes. My mother had known. She had known exactly how greedy and ruthless her son was. She knew he would tear the house apart looking for the wall safe, but she also knew he was far too arrogant and spiritually empty to ever open her worn-out Bible. She had hidden the true key to her legacy in plain sight, waiting for the only person who would actually care enough to look for it. I turned toward the front door, escorted by the police officers. Bradley and Chloe stood in the grand foyer, their faces glowing with arrogant victory, believing they had successfully crushed me and won the entire war. They thought they had left me with absolutely nothing. I stepped out into the freezing, pouring rain, clutching the old Bible tight against my beating heart. The cold wind whipped my wet hair across my face, but I did not feel the chill anymore. I walked down the long driveway toward my dented 12-year-old Honda Civic. I slid into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and gently pulled the hidden metal key from the spine of the holy book. It gleamed perfectly in the dim light of the street lamp. Bradley had the forged paper, but I had the key to the real truth, and tomorrow morning I was going to burn his entire stolen empire to the ground. The engine roared to life, and I drove off into the stormy night ready to fight back. I barely slept a wink that night. The heavy, jagged metal key I had pulled from the spine of my mother's old Bible sat on my cheap nightstand, mocking me, promising a truth I was both desperate for and terrified to face. When the sun finally rose over Philadelphia, painting the gray morning sky with pale streaks of light, I was already dressed and pacing the worn carpet of my small apartment. I called David the moment I knew he would be awake. I told him absolutely everything that had happened at the house the night before. I told him about the forged deed. I told him about the violently smashed wall safe. I told him about the police officers who had nearly put me in handcuffs, and I told him about the hidden key. David did not hesitate for a single second. He picked me up 20 minutes later in his reliable sedan. We drove in a tense, heavy silence to the main branch of my mother's bank in the city center. It was a massive, intimidating, historical stone building that felt far more like a cold fortress than a neighborhood financial institution. Walking through those heavy brass doors, my stomach twisted into tight, painful knots. What if the safe deposit box was completely empty? What if Bradley had somehow forged more documents and found a way to clean this out too? I walked up to the teller and presented my mother's official death certificate, my state identification, and the legal paperwork proving I was her daughter. The bank manager, an older woman with kind, sympathetic eyes, led David and me away from the busy lobby and down into the sterile, brightly lit basement vault. The thick concrete walls were lined with thousands of small, identical metal doors. She matched the engraved number on my key to a box near the bottom corner, inserted her master key, and gestured for me to use mine. My hand trembled so violently, I dropped the key on the cold tile floor on my first try. David placed a steady, reassuring hand on my shoulder. I took a deep breath, picked the key up, slid it into the lock, and turned. The heavy metal drawer slid out with a smooth, echoing metallic scrape. I pulled it free and carried it to a small private viewing room, setting it down carefully on the center of the polished wooden table. The room was completely silent, heavily insulated by the thick basement walls. David and I exchanged a long, anxious look before I finally reached out and lifted the metal lid. Inside the box, resting on the dark velvet bottom, was a small, sleek black USB drive and a single sealed white envelope. My name was written beautifully across the front of the envelope in my mother's familiar, elegant handwriting. I reached into the box and picked up the envelope. The paper felt heavy and incredibly fragile in my shaking hands. Hot tears completely blurred my vision before I even managed to break the wax seal. I had spent 2 agonizing years watching her sharp mind slip away, watching her forget the names of her favorite classic novels, watching her look at me with blank eyes, forgetting who I was entirely. Seeing her steady, perfectly controlled handwriting from a time when she was still entirely herself broke my heart all over again. I carefully tore open the envelope and unfolded the thick cream-colored stationery. The letter was dated 3 years ago, a full 12 months before she ever got sick. I took a deep breath to steady my racing heart and began to read aloud, my voice cracking in the quiet, insulated room. "My dearest Hannah," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means my time has passed, and your brother Bradley has shown you exactly who he really is. I am so deeply sorry to leave you with this heavy burden, but you are the only one strong enough and honest enough to carry it." The words hit me like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. She knew. I kept reading, my pulse pounding faster and louder with every single sentence. "I know you have always thought I was blind to your brother's massive flaws. I know you truly believed I favored his flashy, loud success over your quiet, steady dedication. But I was never blind, Hannah. I saw absolutely everything. 3 years ago, I noticed strange, unexplainable discrepancies in my primary investment accounts. There were large, unauthorized withdrawals. I hired a private forensic accountant to investigate the matter quietly without alerting the family. What I found broke my heart into a million pieces. Bradley has been systematically embezzling money from my retirement accounts for the past 3 years to artificially prop up his failing real estate investment company. He has been drowning in massive corporate debt for years. The Marquise, hiding his tremendous business failures behind expensive tailored suits and luxury ski vacations. He thought I was just an old naive widow who would never notice the missing funds. He thought I was stupid. He severely underestimated me. And more importantly, he drastically underestimated you. I had to stop reading for a moment, wiping the hot, fast tears away from my cheeks. David was sitting across the table staring at the letter in absolute stunned shock. My mother had known everything. While Bradley was parading around the affluent suburbs playing the role of the wealthy, highly successful son, she had been quietly watching him steal her life savings. I looked back down at the letter and continued reading. I could have turned him into the federal authorities right then, but he is my son. A mother always hopes her child will find his way back to the light and do the right thing. I gave him every silent opportunity to confess his crimes and repay what he stole from our family. Instead of repenting, he simply took more. So I made my own arrangements to protect you. The USB drive in this box contains every single piece of undeniable evidence. It holds the forensic accounting reports, the records of the unauthorized wire transfers, and the fake investment portfolios he created to cover his tracks. Everything you need to prove his federal crimes is on that drive. Do not let him intimidate you, Hannah. Do not let his expensive lawyers scare you. Do not let him steal the modest life you have worked so incredibly hard to build. You have always been my greatest pride and my greatest joy. With all my love, Mom. I set the letter down on the wooden table. My hands were still shaking, but this time it was not from fear or grief. It was from an overwhelming, profound sense of validation that washed over my entire soul. For my entire life, I had felt completely invisible in my own family. I had felt like the unappreciated secondary child who was only good for doing chores and taking care of the sick. But my mother had seen me. She had known my immense strength. She had trusted me to finish the fight she could not physically fight herself. I reached out and picked up the small black USB drive. This was not just a piece of plastic storage. It was a loaded weapon. It was the absolute undeniable truth that would completely dismantle Bradley's fake empire of lies and deceit. David gently took this drive from my hand, his eyes wide with professional awe and serious concern. "Hannah," he said, his voice hushed and urgent, "if what your mother says in this letter is true, this is a massive string of federal crimes. We are talking about severe wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and elder financial abuse. Bradley is looking at years in federal prison. We need to take this straight to the police detectives right now." I nodded, a cold, hard determination settling deep into my bones. I felt a powerful surge of energy replace the exhaustion of the past 2 years. Yes, I said firmly. We are going to the police precinct right now. We packed the precious letter and the USB drive safely into the zippered compartment of my purse and left the bank vault. We walked up the marble stairs and out through the heavy brass doors. The terrible rain from the previous night had finally stopped, entirely leaving the city streets shining brightly under a pale, watery morning sun. For the first time in 24 months, I actually felt like I could take a full, deep breath. The crushing, suffocating weight of Bradley's threats in the parking lot was completely gone. I had the power now. I had the proof. We walked quickly down the sidewalk toward David's parked car, making a solid plan to head directly to the police precinct located in my mother's suburban district. But as we passed a small, busy corner coffee shop, my stomach gave a loud, painful rumble. I suddenly realized with a dizzying wave of lightheadedness that I had not eaten a single piece of food since the morning of the funeral. "Let us grab a quick coffee and a bagel before we go to the station," I said, stopping near the entrance and pulling my wallet out of my purse. It might be a very long afternoon sitting in a room with the detectives. We need to eat something. David nodded in agreement, and we stepped inside the warm, coffee-scented shop. I ordered our food and swiped my debit card at the register. The small payment machine beeped an angry, discordant tone. The digital screen flashed a bright red message. Declined. I frowned, staring at the little screen in confusion. That was completely impossible. I had just received my public school teaching paycheck through direct deposit exactly 2 days ago. It was definitely not a lot of money, but it was certainly enough to cover $15 worth of coffee and bagels. I smiled apologetically at the cashier, feeling a hot flush of embarrassment rise in my cheeks, and pulled out my smartphone to check my mobile banking app. I logged into my account fully expecting to see a simple bank server error or perhaps a routine fraud alert block from a weird transaction. Instead, the screen loaded to show my available checking balance. $0.00. A massive icy wave of panic crashed violently over me. I refreshed the app frantically, my thumb tapping the screen over and over again. The numbers absolutely did not change. Right below my checking account, my small emergency savings account displayed the exact same terrifying, impossible number. $0. Everything was completely gone. "David," I whispered, staring blindly at my phone screen in absolute paralyzing horror. "My money. It is all gone. My accounts are completely empty." David quickly paid the confused cashier with cash from his pocket, grabbed my arm firmly, and pulled me outside onto the relatively quiet sidewalk. "What do you mean it is gone?" he asked, his professional accountant instincts instantly taking over. "Did someone hack your bank account?" "I do not know." I stammered, my fingers flying nervously across my phone screen to dial the customer service number for my bank. The automated voice system felt like it took hours to navigate. When I finally reached a human representative, I practically shouted my account details and security answers into the receiver. "Ma'am," the bank representative said, her voice dropping into a very cautious, highly apologetic tone. "I see your accounts right here on my screen. They have not been hacked by an outside party. They have been officially frozen by a court order." "A court order?" I repeated, my voice rising in sheer panic. "What court order? I am a public high school teacher. I do not have any lawsuits or outstanding debts." The representative paused for a long moment, clearly reading a complex file on her end. "According to the legal file attached to your profile, a temporary restraining order and a complete asset freeze was executed on your accounts early this morning. The filing agency is a private law firm, Harrington and Cole." The name hit me like a runaway freight train. Harrington and Cole. That was the hyper-aggressive, incredibly expensive corporate law firm Bradley used to bully people in all of his cutthroat real estate acquisitions. The representative continued reading the dreadful note. The freeze was officially granted by a judge due to an emergency injunction regarding an open investigation into senior citizen financial embezzlement and grand theft from an estate. The phone slipped from my trembling fingers and clattered onto the wet concrete sidewalk. I stood there completely paralyzed as the horrific, brilliant reality of what Bradley had actually done washed over me in waves of pure terror. He had not just threatened me in the rainy parking lot the night before, he had gone straight to his ruthless corporate lawyers the very moment he drove away from the house. He knew I would be looking for the truth. He knew I would try to find the evidence he had overlooked. so he decided to completely cripple me before I could ever fight back. He had taken the exact federal crimes he committed against our own mother, the embezzlement, the massive theft, the sickening elder abuse, and he had legally formally accused me of doing them. He had used his massive wealth and his powerful legal connections to convince a sleeping judge to freeze my meager teacher's salary. He had strategically cut off my only source of money for food, for rent, for gas, for basic survival. I had the USB drive sitting right there in my purse. I had the absolute truth, but without a single dollar to my name, without the ability to even hire a basic defense lawyer to protect myself against his massive corporate legal team, I was completely, utterly powerless. Bradley wanted me to starve. He wanted me desperate. He wanted me to crawl back to him on my hands and knees, begging to sign that waiver just so I could afford to buy my next meal. I was standing on the street corner, holding the exact evidence that could destroy his entire life, and I was completely terrified that he had already destroyed mine. I spent the next 3 days surviving on a 12-pack of cheap chicken-flavored instant noodles I found shoved in the very back of my pantry. Every single time I boiled water on my small electric stove, I thought about Bradley sitting in his luxury in downtown condominium, probably drinking an expensive glass of imported wine and laughing at how easily he had crushed me. He had timed his legal strike with absolute devastating perfection. It was the very first week of the month. My apartment rent was due, my electricity and heating utilities were due. When my property manager knocked heavily on my door and handed me a bright pink notice of pending eviction, I felt a wave of profound humiliation so intense it made my ears ring. I was a hard-working public school history teacher. I had paid my bills on time for my entire adult life. Now, because of my brother's manufactured lies and his ruthless corporate lawyers, I was staring at the terrifying imminent reality of losing the roof over my head. I had exactly $0 to my name. My bank accounts were completely frozen, locked down by an aggressive court injunction that painted me as a thief. But as I sat at my small kitchen table staring at that bright pink slip of paper, something powerful shifted deep inside my chest. I did not break down. I did not cry a single tear. The paralyzing fear of homelessness was entirely burned away by a cold, righteous anger. Bradley wanted me to panic. He wanted me to call him, begging and pleading for a tiny fraction of my own inheritance, just so I could keep my apartment and buy fresh groceries. He wanted to break my spirit so completely that I would sign his forged waiver without another word. I absolutely refused to give him that satisfaction. My phone vibrated violently on the table. It was David. My accountant and best friend had been working his own professional contacts relentlessly since the very moment my financial accounts were frozen. I picked up the call, and his voice was completely breathless with adrenaline. "Put your warmest coat on right now," David said, instantly skipping any polite greeting. "I am parked downstairs outside your building. I know exactly who we need to see." I grabbed my purse, clutching the black USB drive, and my mother's handwritten letter safely inside the zippered pocket, and ran down the stairs to his waiting car. David explained his plan rapidly as he navigated the heavy, chaotic Philadelphia traffic. He refused to let me fight this battle alone. We were going to see Attorney Sterling. David explained that Sterling was not one of those flashy, overpriced corporate lawyers who operated out of a massive glass skyscraper like the ones Bradley hired. Sterling was an older, highly seasoned veteran of the legal system who worked out of a modest, unassuming brick building located just 2 blocks away from the main county courthouse. According to David, Sterling had built a formidable 40-year career, specifically destroying arrogant, wealthy predators who thought they could use the complex legal system to bully and bankrupt innocent people. He had a fierce, well-documented hatred for greedy corporate executives. He despised men exactly like my brother. We walked into Sterling's office 15 minutes later. The room smelled comfortably of old parchment paper, strong dark roast coffee, and decades of hard-fought justice. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with thick leather-bound legal volumes. Attorney Sterling sat behind a massive, incredibly heavy wooden desk. He had sharp gray eyes, a neatly trimmed silver beard, and an incredibly calm, grounding demeanor that immediately made my racing heart begin to slow down. He did not offer any empty platitudes or fake rehearsed sympathy about my mother's passing. He simply looked at me, folded his large hands together on his desk, and asked to hear the exact unfiltered truth. I told him absolutely everything. I explained the fake financial debt report Bradley had presented. I detailed the forged power of attorney he used to steal the family house. I described the violently smashed and empty wall safe in my mother's office. Finally, I explained the cruel, calculated legal injunction that had frozen my meager teacher's salary and left me facing immediate eviction. When I finished speaking, I reached into my purse and placed my mother's handwritten letter and the black USB drive directly onto his massive wooden desk. Sterling read my mother's letter in complete, unbroken silence. His sharp eyes scanned her elegant handwriting, absorbing every single word about Bradley's massive 3-year embezzlement scheme. Then he picked up the small USB drive and plugged it securely into his desktop computer. As his eyes tracked across the digital files, reading the forensic accounting reports and the actual bank statements my mother had carefully hidden, a slow, extremely satisfied smile spread across his weathered face. "Your mother was an absolute genius," Sterling said, his deep voice thick with genuine professional admiration. He reached out and turned his large computer monitor so David and I could clearly see the screen. "Your brother thought he was playing a high-stakes game of chess against a helpless widow, but your mother was playing a completely different game entirely. She was 10 steps ahead of him the entire time." Sterling pointed a long finger to a complex, incredibly dense legal document displayed on the glowing screen. He explained that 2 years ago, right around the time she first noticed the missing funds from her retirement accounts, my mother had quietly and secretly retained a federal financial specialist. She established a highly secure, heavily guarded financial vehicle known as an irrevocable trust. "This is not a standard everyday last will and testament," Sterling explained, looking at me intently to ensure I understood the magnitude of what he was saying. "An irrevocable trust is an ironclad legal structure protected by very strict federal banking laws. Once a person moves their assets into this specific type of trust, those assets cannot be altered, sold, liquidated, or touched by anyone outside the trust without triggering massive federal banking alarms. Your mother moved every single dollar of her true wealth, her bonds, her investments, and the true deed to the house completely out of her personal name and directly into this federal fortress. Bradley's forged power of attorney is completely useless because she did not legally own those assets when she died. The trust owned them. But that was not even the best part. Sterling scrolled down the document to a specific, heavily highlighted section near the bottom of the trust agreement. "This is called a clawback clause," Sterling explained, tapping the screen firmly with the end of his pen. "It is a highly aggressive, deeply punitive defensive mechanism built directly into the federal trust framework. Your mother knew Bradley would eventually try to use fake documents to steal her remaining estate after she passed away. She anticipated his exact greedy move, so she legally bound all of her true wealth to this specific legal trigger. If any individual attempts to use forged documents like a fake power of attorney or a fabricated debt report to misappropriate the assets belonging to this estate, the clawback clause is automatically and instantly activated." I leaned forward in my chair, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "What does that mean exactly?" I asked, my voice barely above an anxious whisper. Sterling leaned back in his heavy leather chair, his sharp grey eyes locking directly onto mine with a fierce predatory gleam. "It means total instantaneous financial annihilation for the person committing the fraud. The very moment this specific clause is triggered, it legally authorizes the federal banking system to immediately freeze every single personal and business account tied to the fraudster's social security number. All of their personal money, their corporate business holdings, their luxury real estate portfolios, absolutely everything is seized. The system automatically transfers their wealth directly into the protection of the trust to compensate for the attempted theft. It completely strips the thief of their assets. And simultaneously, the activation generates an automatic, unblockable alert to federal law enforcement, triggering a mandatory criminal investigation for wire fraud and elder abuse." David let out a loud gasp of pure shock from the chair next to me. He looked at me, his face glowing with a triumphant, overwhelming realization. "Hannah," David said, his voice shaking with excitement, "your mother did not just leave you her money. She left you a loaded trap perfectly designed to destroy him." A profound, breathtaking wave of awe washed over me. My mother had laid in that medical hospital bed in her living room for 2 years, letting Bradley firmly believe he had outsmarted her. She had endured his fake smiles and his empty promises while secretly building a federal vault that would completely ruin him the very second he tried to steal from me. She had protected me from the grave. "We need to activate this immediately," I said, my voice shaking with raw anticipation and a desperate need for justice. "How do we do it?" "Yeah, can we just take this USB drive to the police precinct right now and show them the files?" Sterling shook his head slowly, holding up a large, cautious hand to stop me. "Not yet," he warned, his voice turning incredibly serious. "The trap your mother built is brilliant, but it requires a very specific, undeniable trigger to lock its jaws permanently. Right now, Bradley has only shown you the fake financial report in a private meeting room behind closed doors. He used his lawyers to freeze your accounts based on unproven allegations. He has been careful not to submit anything to the actual government yet. To trigger the federal clawback clause, the crime must be committed permanently on the official legal record." Sterling leaned forward, placing both hands flat on his polished desk. For the trap to fall, Bradley must formally and legally submit his forged financial report and the fake power of attorney to a court-appointed arbitrator. He has to legally swear under penalty of federal perjury that those fake documents are completely authentic. The moment a court arbitrator stamps those papers and accepts them into the official record, Bradley commits the ultimate, undeniable federal crime. That is the exact second the trust activates. That is the exact second his entire empire burns to the ground. I sat back in my chair and took a deep, steadying breath. My brother wanted to starve me out. He wanted me desperate enough to surrender my rights. He wanted me to crawl back to him on my hands and knees begging for a tiny piece of bread. But instead, I was going to give him exactly what he thought he wanted. I was going to give him the perfect, gleaming opportunity to hang himself with his own greed. I looked at Attorney Sterling, feeling the heavy weight of the upcoming battle settle squarely onto my shoulders. "Can we get an arbitration meeting scheduled quickly?" I asked. "I cannot survive much longer with my bank accounts frozen. My landlord gave me less than 2 weeks before the eviction becomes final. Every day that passes is another day Bradley thinks he's winning." Sterling offered a cold, calculated smile that made him look incredibly dangerous. "Do not worry about your living situation, Hannah. My firm will advance you whatever funds you need to keep your apartment secure and your pantry full. You will not lose your home. As for the arbitration, I will personally contact your brother's expensive legal team this afternoon. I will tell them that you are terrified, completely out of money, and ready to concede. I will tell them you want to hold a formal mediation to officially sign the estate over to him and wash your hands of the supposed debt. His ego is far too massive to ever suspect a trap. He will jump at the chance to finalize his theft on the official record." David squeezed my shoulder gently. "He's going to walk right into it, Hannah. He's going to be so blinded by his own greed that he will never see the federal clawback coming until it is way too late." I nodded slowly, letting the reality of the plan sink deep into my mind. Bradley had spent my entire life looking down on me. He had mocked my career as a public school teacher. He and Chloe had insulted my intelligence and tried to leave me with absolutely nothing. They truly believed that people with money and power could simply crush anyone who stood in their way. They were about to learn a very painful, very permanent lesson about the law, about my mother's fierce protective love, and about the terrible price of absolute greed. "Set the meeting," I told Sterling, my voice ringing with a fierce, unbreakable resolve. "Let us give my brother exactly what he deserves." The day of the formal mediation arrived with a bright, mocking sunlight that felt entirely out of place. I drove my dented 12-year-old Honda Civic through the towering wrought iron gates of the Oakmont Country Club. This was an exclusive members-only establishment located in one of the wealthiest zip codes in Pennsylvania. It was a place where initiation fees cost more than my entire annual teaching salary. Bradley had specifically chosen this location for our legal meeting under the guise of providing a comfortable and private setting. But I knew exactly why we were really here. He wanted to completely strip me of my confidence. He wanted me to feel utterly small, out of place, and powerless before we even sat down at the table. I handed my keys to a valet dressed in a crisp white uniform. He looked at my fading, scratched bumper with a flicker of poorly concealed disdain before handing me a ticket. I walked up the massive stone steps toward the grand entrance, my cheap black flats clicking softly against the pristine marble. I had lost 8 pounds in the last 2 weeks alone, surviving on a diet of cheap instant noodles and tap water combined with the crushing anxiety of my frozen bank accounts and my pending apartment eviction had left me looking gaunt and severely depleted. My simple dark dress, the exact same one I had worn to the law office days ago, hung loosely on my shrinking frame. I looked exactly like a woman who had been beaten down by life. I looked desperate. I looked broken. A hostess in a tailored suit guided me through the opulent main dining room, past wealthy patrons eating poached salmon and discussing their stock portfolios, and down a long, quiet corridor lined with expensive landscape paintings. She pushed open a set of heavy mahogany double doors, leading into a private executive suite. The blast of warm, vanilla-scented air hit my face instantly. I stepped into the room, and the visual contrast before me was so violently sharp it actually made my stomach turn. Bradley and Chloe were already seated at one side of a long, highly polished mahogany table. They did not look like people attending a solemn legal mediation to settle a deceased mother's estate. They looked like people celebrating a massive lottery win. Bradley wore a bespoke light grey suit that fit his shoulders with aggressive perfection. The heavy, gold face of a Rolex watch gleamed from under his crisp white shirt cuff. Chloe sat beside him, wearing an emerald green silk dress, her blonde hair professionally styled, thick diamond studs sparkling in her ears. But the detail that truly made my blood run cold was sitting right in the center of the table between them. It was a silver ice bucket sweating with condensation holding a bottle of vintage champagne. 2 crystal flutes sat in front of them, already half empty. They were drinking. They were actively celebrating my financial ruin and my mother's passing before the paperwork was even signed. Chloe looked up as I entered. Her eyes swept up and down my thin frame, taking in my hollow cheeks and my cheap oversized dress. A slow, incredibly cruel smirk spread across her perfectly painted lips. She leaned over and whispered something into Bradley's ear. He chuckled a low, arrogant sound before turning his gaze to me. "Hannah," Bradley said, his voice echoing loudly in the spacious room. "You made it. I was beginning to worry your little car broke down on the highway. Please come sit. We have a lot to get through today." I did not say a word to either of them. I kept my eyes focused on the floor, pulling out a heavy leather chair on the opposite side of the table and sitting down. My hands were shaking. I let them shake. I let Bradley see my trembling fingers. I let him see my pale, exhausted face. I was playing the role of the defeated, desperate sister perfectly. Attorney Sterling had told me that the key to catching a predator was making them believe they had already eaten you alive. At the head of the table sat the court-appointed arbitrator. His name was Mr. Harrison, a stern older man with reading glasses and a thick stack of manila folders resting in front of him. He looked at the champagne glasses with a brief flash of professional disapproval, but he did not comment on them. His job was simply to oversee the legal submission of the documents and ensure the estate dispute was formally settled on the official record. "Let us begin," Mr. Harrison said, his voice dry and devoid of any emotion. "We are here today to officially mediate and finalize the estate of the late Susan Sterling. Mr. Bradley Sterling has petitioned to submit the final financial accounting of the estate along with a durable power of attorney executed prior to the deceased's passing. Furthermore, the parties have indicated a willingness to sign a waiver of co-inheritance to resolve the outstanding debts without proceeding to a full probate trial. Is this correct?" Bradley nodded solemnly, instantly dropping his arrogant smirk and replacing it with the manufactured face of a deeply burdened, grieving son. "Yes, Mr. Harrison, that is correct. As we discussed, my mother's medical expenses were catastrophic. The estate is heavily underwater. I am simply trying to wrap this up quickly to protect my younger sister from the vicious creditors who are currently circling our family." I kept my head bowed, staring at the polished wood of the table. Hearing him lie so smoothly, so effortlessly in front of a court official made me sick to my stomach. He was a sociopath. He truly believed he was untouchable. The arbitrator turned his stern gaze to me. "Miss Sterling," he said, addressing me directly, "are you aware of the financial situation of the estate as presented by your brother? Are you prepared to sign the waiver and accept the private settlement he's offering today?" I looked up, letting my voice waver just enough to sound completely broken. "I do not have a choice," I said quietly. "My bank accounts were frozen earlier this week. I cannot afford my apartment rent. I have absolutely nothing left to fight with. I just want this nightmare to end. Chloe let out a small, satisfied sigh and took a delicate sip of her champagne. Bradley leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine with the intense, terrifying focus of a shark smelling blood in the water. "I told you I would take care of you, Hannah," Bradley said softly, playing to the arbitrator. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. These were the forged financial ledgers, the fake bank statements showing hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical debt. And right on top was the fabricated power of attorney, complete with my mother's forged signature and a fake notary stamp. Bradley placed the stack of documents carefully onto the center of the table. Then he reached into his breast pocket and produced the exact same cashier's check he had tried to give me in the law office days ago. My name was printed on the front, $50,000. He slid the check across the smooth mahogany surface. It stopped right in front of my trembling hands. "I am doing this because you are my sister," Bradley said, pitching his voice so the arbitrator could hear his incredible generosity. "This $50,000 will pay your back rent. It will buy your groceries. It will give you a fresh start. All you have to do is let me take on the massive burden of Mom's debt. Let me handle the ugly side of the business." He leaned across the table, closing the physical distance between us. The arbitrator was looking down at his own notes, organizing his formal seals. Bradley lowered his voice to a harsh, mocking whisper that only I could hear. "I told you, Hannah," he hissed, his perfectly white teeth flashing in a cruel, victorious smirk. "Small fish should not venture into the big ocean. You tried to be smart and you ended up starving. Take the lifeline, go back to your little classroom, and never question me again." I stared down at the check. My heart was pounding so hard I felt dizzy. This was the moment. This was the exact threshold Attorney Sterling had warned me about. Bradley was incredibly arrogant, but he was also careful. He wanted me to take the check and sign the waiver first, securing his total immunity before he officially submitted his fake documents to the government. I could not let that happen. The federal trap my mother had built would only snap shut if he submitted his forged evidence to the arbitrator first. I slowly pulled my hands away from the check and looked up at him, letting a single tear fall down my hollow cheek. "I will sign the waiver, Bradley," I said, my voice shaking with perfectly acted defeat. "I will take the check, but I need you to finalize the estate first. I need to know that the court accepts your documents and that the creditors will not come after me tomorrow. I need Mr. Harrison to stamp the financial reports and the power of attorney on the official record right now. Once he accepts your documents and formally clears me of the debt, I will sign your waiver." Bradley frowned slightly, a brief shadow of suspicion crossing his handsome face. He looked at me closely, searching for any sign of a trick. But all he saw was a thin, starving, exhausted woman wearing a cheap dress who was terrified of losing her apartment. His massive ego simply could not allow him to believe that I was capable of outsmarting him. He believed he had completely crushed my spirit. He believed his brutal strategy of freezing my bank accounts had worked flawlessly. Chloe nudged his arm gently. "Just do it, Bradley," she whispered impatiently. "Let us get this over with so we can go to dinner." Bradley relaxed his shoulders, his arrogant smirk returning in full force. "Fine," he said smoothly. "If seeing the official stamp is what it takes to make you feel safe, little sister, I am happy to oblige." He gathered the thick stack of forged financial ledgers, the fake bank statements, and the fraudulent power of attorney. He squared the edges of the papers by tapping them against the table. Then, with a confident, sweeping motion, he handed the entire stack directly to the court-appointed arbitrator. Mr. Harrison, Bradley said loudly and clearly, "I am officially submitting these documents as the true, accurate, and complete financial record of Susan Sterling's estate. I am also submitting this durable power of attorney executed prior to her passing, which grants me full legal authority over her real estate and financial holdings." Mr. Harrison adjusted his reading glasses and took the heavy stack of papers. He pulled a formal submission form from his own folder and placed it in front of Bradley. Mr. Sterling, the arbitrator, said, his voice echoing with serious legal authority. "You understand that you are submitting these financial documents to an officer of the court. Do you swear under penalty of federal perjury that the financial reports and the power of attorney you are handing me today are authentic, completely accurate, and represent the true state of your late mother's assets?" I held my breath. The entire room seemed to freeze. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background. My hands gripped the fabric of my dress under the table so tightly my fingers ached. Bradley did not hesitate for a single second. He looked the arbitrator squarely in the eye, wearing the face of an honest, burdened man. "I do," Bradley swore firmly. "Every single page is absolutely authentic." He picked up his heavy silver pen and signed his name with a bold, aggressive flourish on the arbitrator's official submission form. Mr. Harrison nodded solemnly. He took the form, placed it on top of Bradley's forged documents, and picked up his heavy metal legal seal. With a loud, echoing thud, the arbitrator stamped the paperwork. "The documents are now accepted into the official court record," Mr. Harrison announced, sliding the file into his official briefcase. "The estate inventory is formally registered." I let out a long, slow breath. The intense burning knot of anxiety in my stomach instantly uncoiled, replaced by a massive rushing wave of pure adrenaline. Bradley had just done it. He had walked right up to the edge of the cliff and thrown himself over. He had formally submitted forged documents to misappropriate assets. He had sworn to a lie under penalty of federal perjury. He had just activated the irrevocable trust. The trap was officially set. The jaws were locked. And my brother had absolutely no idea that his entire world was about to be burned to the ground. The heavy metallic thud of the arbitrator's seal echoed through the quiet executive suite. It was the sound of a trap snapping entirely shut. Bradley let out a long breath, completely unaware that he had just sealed his own destruction. He leaned back in his plush leather chair, reaching for his crystal flute of champagne. He raised it toward me in a silent, mocking toast. But before the glass could even touch his lips, the heavy mahogany double doors of the conference room swung open with a violent crash. Attorney Sterling walked into the room. He did not knock. He did not ask for permission. He moved with the slow, terrifying certainty of a tidal wave. Right behind him was David, holding a thick black leather briefcase. Bradley lowered his champagne glass, his perfectly manicured eyebrows drawing together in a sharp scowl. "Excuse me," Bradley snapped, standing up and pointing a finger at the door. "This is a private legal mediation. You cannot just walk in here." Attorney Sterling ignored him completely. He walked directly to the head of the polished table and stood right next to Mr. Harrison. He towered over the court-appointed arbitrator, projecting an aura of absolute, uncompromising authority. "My name is Arthur Sterling," he announced, his deep, resonant voice filling every corner of the room. "I am the senior partner at Sterling and Hayes and I represent the true estate of Susan Sterling. I am here to formally halt these fraudulent proceedings." Bradley let out a loud, patronizing laugh, looking at Mr. Harrison as if dealing with a confused elderly man. "I am the executor of the estate," he said smoothly. "I have the power of attorney. We just finalized the submissions. You are too late, whoever you are." Sterling reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, beautifully bound document secured with a heavy blue legal ribbon. He dropped it onto the center of the table, right next to Bradley's stack of forged papers. It landed with a heavy smack. "That is where you are catastrophically wrong," Mr. Sterling, the attorney, said. His voice was dangerously calm. "What you just submitted is a collection of amateur forgeries. Your mother did not own a single asset in her personal name when she passed away. 2 years ago, she established a federally protected, irrevocable trust. The trust owns the house on the main line. The trust owns the investment portfolios. The trust owns absolutely everything. And as of this morning, Hannah is the sole uncontested trustee." I watched the color drain completely out of Bradley's face. His artificial tan suddenly looked like grey ash. Chloe set her champagne glass down so hard, the crystal stem nearly snapped. She stared at the blue ribbon on the document, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "That is impossible," Bradley stammered, stepping forward. "I was managing her accounts. I have the power of attorney. She signed it over to me a month ago." Sterling unclasped his leather briefcase and pulled out a second folder. This one was bright red and stamped with the official seal of the Pennsylvania State Medical Board. He opened it and laid 3 glossy pages side by side across the table. "Let us talk about that power of attorney," Bradley Sterling said, his tone sharpening into a lethal weapon. "You claim your mother signed that document transferring all her rights to you on October 12th. You brought a notary public on your company payroll to witness the signature. It looks very official. It looks very convincing. There is only one massive, undeniable problem." Sterling tapped the red folder. I have here your mother's certified medical record subpoenaed directly from the critical care unit of Philadelphia General Hospital. On October 12th, the exact day you claim she sat up and signed her entire life over to your corporate holding company, Susan Sterling was in a deep medically induced coma. The silence in the room became absolute. Nobody breathed. Even the arbitrator, Mr. Harrison, took his glasses off and stared at the medical records in profound shock. She was intubated. Sterling continued, his voice ringing with righteous fury. She had a Glasgow coma scale score of 3. She was physically incapable of opening her eyes, let alone comprehending and executing a highly complex legal transfer of real estate. You forged her signature, Bradley. You used a corrupt notary to stamp a fraudulent document while your own mother was fighting for her life on a ventilator. Bradley stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of his chair. He looked like a man who had just been punched in the throat. That is a lie, he choked out, looking desperately at the arbitrator. He is making this up. She had moments of clarity. She woke up and signed it. No, she did not, I said. My voice broke the silence, steady and clear. I stopped acting like the terrified, broken woman I had been pretending to be. I sat up straight in my chair and looked my brother directly in the eyes. I was sitting right next to her bed on October 12th, Bradley. I sat there for 18 hours straight holding her hand. Her eyes never opened. You never even came to the hospital that day. You were at a country club dinner. I have the visitor logs from the nursing station to prove it. Chloe turned to look at her husband. Her emerald green silk dress suddenly looked entirely out of place on a woman whose eyes were wide with rising panic. Bradley, she whispered, her voice trembling. What is he talking about? You said her lawyers drafted that paper. You said she wanted us to have the house. Bradley ignored his wife. He was sweating now. Thick, heavy beads of perspiration gathered on his forehead and dripped down the side of his face, ruining his perfect image. He pointed a shaking finger at me. You cannot prove any of this. Even if that trust exists, she owes massive medical debts. I am taking on her liabilities. I brought a $50,000 check today to help her out of my own pocket. I am trying to save her. That was the exact moment David stepped forward. My best friend, the quiet, meticulous accountant who had spent the last 3 days digging through miles of digital banking records, walked up to the mahogany table. He did not look intimidated by the luxury of the room or the expensive suits. He looked like a man holding a royal flush. Let us talk about that $50,000 check, David said calmly. He reached into his own bag and pulled out a stack of banking flowcharts. He passed copies to the arbitrator, to Sterling, and finally he slid one directly over to Bradley. You told Hannah you were giving her this money out of your own personal savings. David stated, his voice completely professional, but laced with deep disgust. You claimed it was an act of brotherly charity to help a poor public school teacher. But you do not have $50,000 in personal savings, Bradley. Your real estate firm is drowning in debt. Your corporate accounts are completely over-leveraged. You are functionally broke. Bradley swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically across the flowchart. Do not look at my financials, he hissed. That is highly confidential information. It became my business when you tried to use it to extort my client. David fired back smoothly. I traced the routing numbers on that cashier's check you just proudly displayed to the arbitrator. The funds did not originate from your personal checking account. They did not come from your corporate holdings. They were wired out of a highly secure, private wealth management account at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. David leaned over the table, placing his finger firmly on the bottom line of the flowchart. That account does not belong to you. It is a secret retirement fund that Susan Sterling set up 10 years ago. And the sole exclusive beneficiary listed on that account is Hannah. I felt the air leave my lungs. I stared at David, then at the paper. My mother had set up a retirement fund for me. She had been secretly saving money to protect my future, knowing I was sacrificing my own savings to work as a teacher and care for her. You stole her money, David said, looking Bradley dead in the face. You hacked into your mother's private portfolio after she died. You illegally initiated a wire transfer of $50,000 out of Hannah's own inheritance, and then you sat at this table and tried to use Hannah's own money to bribe her into signing away the rest of her estate. You tried to buy her off with her own stolen cash. The sheer absolute depravity of his actions hung in the room like a toxic cloud. He had not just abandoned us. He had not just forged a deed. He had actively reached into the pockets of his grieving sister, stolen her secure future, and wrapped it up in a fake bow to force her into a legal trap. Chloe let out a sharp, horrified gasp. She covered her mouth with both hands, staring at Bradley as if he had just turned into a monster right in front of her. "Bradley, tell me this is not true," she begged, her voice rising in hysteria. "Tell me you did not steal from her. You told me the company was fine. You told me we're safe." "Shut up, Chloe," Bradley snapped viciously, losing every ounce of his polished charm. He grabbed the cashier's check off the table and shoved it into his pocket. "Fine. If you people want to play hardball, we will play hardball. I withdraw my settlement offer. I withdraw the paperwork. We will take this to probate court, and I will let the judges bleed this estate dry for the next 10 years. You get absolutely nothing, Hannah." He turned to walk away, grabbing Chloe by the arm and dragging her toward the heavy double doors. "You are not going anywhere." Bradley, Attorney Sterling's voice boomed across the room, carrying the weight of absolute finality. Bradley stopped in his tracks, turning his head to glare at the older lawyer. "You cannot hold me here. I am leaving." Sterling picked up the stamped documents from the arbitrator's desk. "You seem to misunderstand the situation," he said softly, a cold smile touching the corners of his mouth. "You just formally submitted forged financial records and a fraudulent power of attorney to a court-appointed official. You swore under penalty of federal perjury that these documents were real, so what Bradley sneered, though his voice trembled, "I take it back." "You cannot take it back," Sterling replied, "because the exact second the arbitrator stamped those papers, you activated the clawback clause hidden inside your mother's irrevocable trust." Bradley's eyes widened in genuine, unmasked terror. "What are you talking about? What clause?" Sterling began to read from the blue ribbon document. "If any party attempts to misappropriate assets belonging to this trust through the use of fraudulent documentation, legal deception, or forged signatures, the trust protective measures are immediately and permanently activated." Sterling took a slow, deliberate step toward my brother. "You see, Bradley, federal trusts are monitored closely. The very moment you submitted those fake papers to claim ownership of the trust's assets, you provided irrefutable documented proof of wire fraud and elder financial abuse on the official legal record. By signing that submission form, you did not close an inheritance case. You officially confessed to federal crimes." "No," Bradley whispered, shaking his head frantically. "No, that is not possible. I did not know about the trust. You cannot do this." "It is already done," Sterling said. "The clawback clause dictates that all personal and business assets belonging to the offending party are to be instantly frozen to compensate the trust for the attempted theft. As of 5 minutes ago, my team filed the automatic injunctions with every major banking institution in the state." Bradley reached into his pocket with violently shaking hands and pulled out his phone. He furiously tapped the screen, opening his banking app. I watched from across the room as the color drained from his face completely. His jaw went slack. The phone slipped from his trembling fingers and shattered against the hard marble floor. His accounts were frozen. The corporate funds, his personal savings, the money he had stolen. It was all locked down. The trap my mother built had just snapped shut around his neck, crushing his entire empire in an instant. Furthermore, Sterling concluded, his voice ringing with absolute triumph, "because you utilized interstate electronic banking systems to transfer the stolen $50,000 this morning. This is no longer just a civil dispute over a family home. You committed felony wire fraud. The arbitrator in this room is legally obligated to report your fraudulent submission to the federal authorities. The FBI and the state prosecutor's office have already received the digital files David compiled." Chloe screamed. It was a high, piercing sound of pure, unadulterated panic. She ripped her arm out of Bradley's grasp and backed away from him until she hit the wall. "You are going to prison," she shrieked, tears ruining her expensive makeup. "You lied to me. You ruined our lives." Bradley looked completely broken, his shoulders slumped. The arrogant, wealthy executive who had strutted into the country club wearing a Rolex and drinking champagne was gone. In his place stood a terrified, pathetic thief who had just lost everything. He looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading. "Hannah," he begged, his voice cracking into a miserable sob. "Please, please, you have to stop this. You have to tell them it was a misunderstanding. I am your brother. We share the same blood. You cannot let them send me to federal prison. Please, Hannah, I will give you whatever you want. I will give you the house. Just tell the lawyer to cancel the injunction." I sat in my chair looking at the man who had abandoned our dying mother, who had forged documents to steal my inheritance, and who had gleefully tried to starve me out of my apartment just 24 hours ago. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I just felt clean. I stood up slowly, smoothing the fabric of my simple dress. I walked around the polished mahogany table until I was standing just a few feet away from him. "I cannot stop it, Bradley," I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any emotion. "I told you I did not understand complex finance. You were the one who wanted to handle the hard business. You were the one who wanted everything on the official record." I turned away from him and looked at David and Attorney Sterling. "We are done here," I said. "Let us go." As I walked out of the executive suite, leaving my brother weeping on the floor of the country club, while his wife screamed at him, I felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the last 2 years finally lift from my shoulders. The storm was over. My mother had protected me, and I had finally learned how to protect myself. I walked out through the heavy mahogany doors and into the bright, clear afternoon light, stepping forward into the beautiful, unburdened rest of my life. The heavy silence in the opulent private suite of the Oakmont Country Club was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that follows a catastrophic car crash before the sound of the sirens begins. The air conditioning hummed softly from the ceiling vents, but the temperature in the room felt freezing cold. The scent of vanilla and expensive leather now seemed completely nauseating. I sat perfectly still in my chair, watching the immediate devastating fallout of the federal trap my mother had built to protect me. The first person to truly understand the sheer magnitude of the disaster was Bradley's high-priced corporate attorney. This was a man who had walked into the mediation room projecting an aura of untouchable wealth and power. He had smirked at my cheap clothes and dismissed my presence as nothing more than a minor annoyance on his way to a large billable hour. But now his face was the color of wet cement. He understood federal law. He understood the absolute ironclad nature of an irrevocable trust and the terrifying automatic enforcement of a clawback clause. More importantly, he understood that his client had just committed a massive federal felony right in front of an official court arbitrator. With a sudden sharp motion, the attorney reached out and snatched his gold-plated pen off the mahogany table. He began shoving his legal pads and pristine files into his luxury leather briefcase with frantic, uncoordinated movements. The smooth, polished professional completely vanished. He looked like a man trying to escape a burning building. Bradley blinked rapidly, turning his head toward his lawyer. His voice was a harsh, raspy whisper. "What are you doing? You need to fix this. Tell them the documents were a mistake. Tell them we withdraw the submission. You are my lawyer. Do something." The attorney snapped his briefcase shut with a loud, violent click that made everyone in the room jump. He did not look at Bradley. He did not look at Chloe. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the polished wood of the table. "I am not your lawyer anymore, Bradley," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "You lied to my firm. You provided us with fraudulent documents, and you just committed perjury under federal law in the presence of a sworn court official. My representation of you is officially terminated effectively immediately. I advise you to retain criminal defense counsel." Bradley reached out and grabbed the sleeve of the lawyer's expensive suit. "You cannot do this to me. I pay your firm hundreds of thousands of dollars. You work for me." The lawyer forcefully ripped his arm out of Bradley's grasp. "You do not have hundreds of thousands of dollars anymore, Bradley." He shot back, his professional facade completely crumbling. "Your accounts are frozen. The trust has reclaimed everything you stole. You are bankrupt, and I am not risking my license to practice law or risking federal prison time to cover up your massive criminal stupidity. Do not call my office again." Without a single glance backward, the attorney turned on his heel and marched out of the heavy double doors, leaving them swinging wildly in his wake. He abandoned his client without a second thought, leaving Bradley completely isolated in the wreckage of his own arrogance. Chloe had been sitting frozen in her chair, her emerald green silk dress rustling as she began to tremble. The vintage champagne in her crystal flute had completely stopped bubbling. She stared at the empty space where the lawyer had just been standing, and the true horrific reality finally crashed down on her. The luxury ski trips to Aspen were over. The designer shopping sprees were over. The massive downtown condominium and the shiny luxury cars were gone. Her husband was not just broke. Her husband was a criminal facing decades behind bars. Chloe let out a sound, that I had never heard a human being make before. It was a high-pitched, breathless shriek of pure, unadulterated hysteria. She slammed her hands flat onto the table, causing her champagne glass to tip over. The expensive liquid spilled across the polished mahogany surface, dripping down onto the thick carpet, but she did not even notice. "You lied to me," Chloe screamed, her face contorting into an ugly mask of rage and terror. "You told me the real estate company was doing perfectly fine. You told me your mother was leaving you everything. You told me Hannah was just a greedy, pathetic loser trying to steal what belonged to us. You completely ruined my life." Bradley put his hands up, trying to calm her down, his eyes darting nervously toward the court arbitrator. "Chloe, please lower your voice. People outside can hear you. We can fix this. I will figure it out. Just stop screaming." "Fix this!" She shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the expensive landscape paintings on the walls. "How are you going to fix this, Bradley? Your accounts are frozen. You just confessed to stealing money from a dead woman and your own sister. The federal government is going to arrest you. You're going to jail. I am not going to jail for you. I am not losing my reputation because you are a pathetic thief. I am calling a divorce lawyer right now." She scrambled backward, knocking her heavy leather chair over in her frantic rush to get away from the table. She grabbed her diamond-encrusted purse and practically ran toward the exit, sobbing hysterically and cursing Bradley's name. The heavy doors slammed shut behind her, plunging the room back into a heavy, suffocating silence. Bradley stood alone at the table. The master manipulator, the arrogant older brother who had bullied and belittled me for my entire adult life, was utterly shattered. He looked down at his trembling hands. The heavy gold Rolex watch on his wrist suddenly looked like a cheap, heavy shackle. He looked at Mr. Harrison, the arbitrator, who was already reaching for his cell phone, with a grim, uncompromising expression. He looked at Attorney Sterling, who stood tall and unmoving, a silent guardian of justice. And then Bradley finally looked at me. I was sitting in my cheap dark dress, my hands resting calmly on my lap. My stomach was completely empty from surviving on instant noodles for 3 days, but my spirit had never been fuller. I did not shrink under his gaze. I did not look away. I held my head high, projecting the quiet, unbreakable strength of the mother who had raised me. Bradley stumbled forward, his legs practically giving out beneath him. He moved around the large mahogany table, his expensive custom suit wrinkling and pulling awkwardly. When he reached my chair, he did something I never thought I would see in a million lifetimes. He dropped heavily to his knees right on the pristine country club carpet. "Hannah, please." He begged, his voice breaking into a wretched, pathetic sob. "Please, you have to stop this. You have to tell them it is all a terrible misunderstanding. You are the sole trustee now. You have the power to withdraw the complaint. You can tell the bank to release the hold on my accounts." I looked down at his tear-stained face. This was the same man who had laughed at me while I worked a grueling public school teaching job just to pay for our mother's medical supplies. This was the man who had tossed a $50,000 check at me exactly 20 minutes ago, telling me that small fish should not venture into the big ocean. This was the man who had legally frozen my tiny bank account, fully intending to make me homeless and starve me into submission. "I cannot do that, Bradley," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any warmth. "The trust is irrevocable. The clawback clause is automatic. The federal authorities have already been notified. It is completely out of my hands. You can tell them not to prosecute." He pleaded, reaching out to grab the hem of my dress with sweaty, trembling fingers. "Hannah, I am your brother. We grew up in the same house. We share the same blood. Our mother would not want to see her only son locked away in a federal prison cell. She would want us to forgive each other. She would want us to be a family. Please do not do this to me. I will give you the house. I will give you back the money I took. Just let me walk away." I felt a cold, sharp spike of disgust rise in my throat. He dared to use our mother's memory as a shield. He dared to invoke the concept of family after completely abandoning her on her deathbed. He had not visited her once during her final months. He had ignored my desperate text messages when her fever spiked. He had forged her signature while she was trapped in a deep medically induced coma. And then he had methodically looted her life savings to fund his luxury lifestyle. He did not care about family. He only cared about saving his own skin. I gently but firmly pulled the fabric of my dress out of his grasping hands. I looked into his terrified eyes, and I let him see the absolute finality of his situation. I remembered the cruel, arrogant smirk on his face when he had offered me that stolen money. I remembered the vicious words he had used to try and break my spirit. I leaned forward slightly, looking straight into his eyes. "I want this settled amicably," I said, repeating his exact cruel words back to him with perfect chilling precision. "You have signed your own death warrant." Bradley gasped, as if I had physically struck him across the face. He collapsed back onto his heels, burying his face in his hands and sobbing loudly into the quiet room. There was no dignity left in him. He was just an empty, hollow shell of a man who had finally met the catastrophic consequences of his own boundless greed. Behind me, Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. The arbitrator had his cell phone pressed to his ear, his posture rigid and formal. "Yes, operator," Mr. Harrison said, his voice carrying the heavy, unmistakable weight of official legal duty. "I need to report an incident of felony wire fraud, elder financial abuse and perjury committed during a formal court arbitration. I am currently at the Oakmont Country Club Private Suite 3. The suspect is completely secured in the room. I have the physical forged documents in my possession, along with digital evidence of unauthorized federal wire transfers. Please send federal agents to my location immediately." Attorney Sterling placed a warm, solid hand on my shoulder. It was a gesture of profound respect and silent congratulations. "You did incredibly well, Hannah," Sterling said, his deep voice incredibly gentle. "Your mother would be immensely proud of the strength you showed today. You stood up to a monster, and you won." I stood up from my chair, stepping away from the pathetic, weeping figure of my brother on the floor. I picked up my modest purse, feeling the solid weight of my mother's old, worn-out Bible resting inside. That book had held the key to the truth. It had held the key to my salvation and my absolute vindication. I walked out of the executive suite with David right by my side. I did not look back at Bradley. I did not need to. His story was completely over. He would face the brutal, unyielding machinery of the federal justice system. He would lose his company, his freedom, and his utterly false reputation. He had tried to bury me in the dark, but he had forgotten that I was a seed planted and nurtured by a brilliant, fiercely protective mother. As David and I walked out the heavy front doors of the country club, the bright afternoon sun felt incredibly warm against my face. My bank accounts would be unfrozen by tomorrow morning. My apartment was completely secure. The inheritance my mother had carefully guarded for me would allow me to teach my students without the crushing daily fear of financial ruin. The long, agonizing nightmare was finally permanently over. The bad men had lost. The innocent were finally safe. And for the very first time in my entire life, I stepped out into the world completely, totally, and wonderfully free. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I truly hope it reminds you that absolute greed always eventually catches up to those who practice it, and that quiet, honest strength will always overpower loud, arrogant cruelty. If my journey resonated with you, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories of justice being served. I would love to hear from you down in the comment section below. Let me know what city you are watching from and what time it is right now. Remember, you never have to tolerate abuse from toxic family members. Always stand your ground, always protect your peace, and never let anyone make you feel small. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next story. The months that followed that explosive afternoon at the country club felt completely surreal. It was as if I had been holding my breath underwater for 2 entire years and finally managed to break the surface. Summer slowly turned into a crisp and colorful autumn. I went back to my classroom at the public high school. I stood in front of my history students every day, teaching them about the rise and fall of ancient empires. I taught them about how unchecked power and absolute greed always lead to inevitable collapse. It was a subject I now understood on a deeply personal level. My own life had settled back into a peaceful, quiet routine. My bank accounts were completely unfrozen within 48 hours of Attorney Sterling presenting the true trust documents to the bank managers. I paid my rent. I bought fresh groceries. I finally slept through the night without waking up in a cold sweat. But while my life was quietly rebuilding itself in the warm light of peace, my brother Bradley was experiencing the absolute terrifying, crushing weight of the American federal justice system. The wheels of federal justice do not turn quickly. Attorney Sterling explained this to me during one of our weekly check-in meetings. He told me that federal prosecutors are incredibly meticulous. They do not rush their investigations. They do not make sloppy mistakes. They take their time to build an airtight, inescapable cage of evidence before they ever make a public move. Public. Bradley had spent the first few weeks after the arbitration meeting desperately trying to pretend that his life was not falling apart. He tried to hire new expensive defense lawyers to somehow fight the clawback clause of my mother's irrevocable trust. But the legal reality was absolute. The trust was protected by strict federal banking laws. The moment he had submitted those forged documents and committed perjury on the official record, he had handed the government a perfect, neatly wrapped confession. The financial ruin happened first. The federal banking authorities completely executed the clawback mechanism my mother had so brilliantly designed. It was a flawless, methodical dismantling of Bradley's entire fake empire. Every single bank account tied to his social security number was frozen and heavily audited. The corporate accounts for his failing real estate firm were seized. The authorities easily traced the $50,000 he had stolen from my secret retirement fund and forcefully transferred it right back into my protected account. But the federal agents did not stop there. Because Bradley had used his business accounts to facilitate wire fraud and launder stolen money, the banks instantly called in all of his massive commercial loans. His real estate company completely collapsed in a matter of days. He had built his entire identity on the illusion of massive wealth, but it was nothing more than a fragile house of cards constructed on a foundation of lies and stolen money. Then came the physical seizures. It was a cold Tuesday morning when the federal marshals arrived at his luxury downtown condominium. I did not go to watch it happen. I had no desire to gloat or celebrate his misery. But David, my faithful accountant and friend, kept me fully informed of the public spectacle. The authorities towed away the pristine black Lexus SUV that Bradley and Chloe had paraded around in. They seized his expensive artwork and his collection of luxury watches to help cover the massive restitution and the federal fines he was accumulating. The grand historical house on the main line, the beautiful home where I had spent my entire childhood, and where I had cared for my dying mother, was legally secured by the trust. Bradley was completely locked out. He was stripped of every single material possession he had ever valued. But the most devastating blow to Bradley did not come from the federal government or the banking institutions. The most profound betrayal came from inside his own home. Chloe had married Bradley for his money, his status, and his arrogant projection of power. She thrived on luxury vacations, expensive champagne, and looking down on people like me. The very second that the illusion of wealth shattered, Chloe completely abandoned ship. She did not stand by her husband during his darkest hour. She did not offer him comfort or support while he faced the terrifying prospect of a federal criminal indictment. Instead, she packed her designer luggage the very morning the federal agents froze their credit cards. According to attorney Sterling, Chloe filed for an expedited divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. But the truth was entirely obvious to everyone involved. She was furious that Bradley had been caught. She realized that he was not the brilliant, untouchable executive she thought he was. He was just a careless, arrogant thief who had ruined her comfortable lifestyle. Chloe hired aggressive divorce lawyers of her own to legally separate herself from his criminal liability. She claimed she had absolutely no knowledge of his forged documents or his embezzlement scheme. She took all of her personal jewelry, her extensive collection of designer handbags, and whatever small amount of cash she had managed to keep in her separate private accounts. She left Bradley completely isolated in an empty rented apartment facing the terrifying wrath of the United States Department of Justice entirely alone. The ultimate irony was not lost on me. Bradley had abandoned his own mother when she was sick and dying because she was no longer useful to him. Now his wife had abandoned him for the exact same reason. The final chapter of this long, exhausting nightmare took place in a heavy oak-paneled federal courtroom exactly 7 months after my mother passed away. I sat quietly in the very back row of the courtroom gallery. I wore a simple, respectful navy blue dress. David sat on my left and Attorney Sterling sat on my right. I did not tell anyone I was coming. I did not want to make a grand entrance or cause a scene. I simply needed to see this process through to its logical conclusion. I needed to witness the final closing of the door. When the heavy wooden doors at the front of the courtroom opened, I barely recognized the man who walked in. Bradley looked like a completely broken shell of a human being. The expensive tailored grey suits and the flashy gold watches were entirely gone. He was wearing a standard-issue dull-tan prison uniform. His posture was completely stooped and his shoulders were slumped in profound defeat. His perfectly styled hair had grown out and his face looked incredibly hollow and grey. The arrogant sneer that he had worn his entire life had been completely erased by months of sheer terror and isolation. He was standing before a federal judge, facing a massive list of felony charges. The prosecutor laid out the case with chilling, methodical precision. They detailed the specific dates of the wire fraud. They presented the forged power of attorney document, complete with the fake notary stamp. They explained how Bradley had intentionally taken advantage of an elderly, dying woman who was entirely incapacitated in a medical coma. They highlighted the extreme predatory nature of his crimes, noting that he had used his victim's own stolen money to attempt to extort his younger sister. The evidence gathered from the small black USB drive my mother had hidden in the bank vault was absolutely bulletproof. Bradley did not fight the charges. His court-appointed public defender had advised him that taking this case to a full jury trial would be complete suicide. The paper trail was simply too overwhelming. The confession he had inadvertently made by submitting the documents to the arbitrator was entirely legally binding. Bradley had accepted a plea deal to avoid spending decades behind bars. When it was time for the judge to hand down the sentence, the entire courtroom fell completely silent. The judge was a stern older woman with sharp eyes and an expression of absolute zero tolerance for white-collar predators. She looked down at Bradley from her high bench, and her words echoed through the large, quiet room. "Mr. Sterling," the judge began, her voice carrying a heavy tone of judicial disgust. "In my years on this bench, I have seen many cases of financial fraud, but the specific nature of your crimes is particularly reprehensible. You did not just defraud a faceless corporation or manipulate a stock market. You systematically stole from your own mother while she was lying on her deathbed. You forged legal documents to completely disenfranchise your own sister, who was sacrificing her life to provide the care that you absolutely refused to give. You operated with a level of callous greed and profound arrogance that is truly shocking to this court." Bradley stood before the judge with his head bowed, looking entirely pathetic. His hands were shaking violently as they rested on the defense table. He did not look back into the gallery. He did not know I was sitting there watching him face his absolute ruin. "You believed that your wealth and your corporate standing made you entirely above the law?" The judge continued, her voice sharp and uncompromising. "You believed that you could simply crush anyone who stood in the way of your personal enrichment. But the American justice system does not recognize your arrogance as a valid defense. Your actions have caused immense emotional and financial distress to your family, and your deliberate abuse of the banking system demands a severe and meaningful consequence." The judge paused, looking at the heavy legal file resting on her desk. She adjusted her glasses and delivered the final absolute blow. "Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that you be remanded to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons to serve a consecutive sentence of 60 months. That is 5 full years in federal prison. Following your release, you will serve 3 years of supervised probation, and you are permanently ordered to pay full and complete restitution to the estate of Susan Sterling." The sound of the judge's wooden gavel hitting the heavy-sounding block echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. It was the exact same sound I had heard when the arbitrator stamped Bradley's forged documents at the country club. But this time, the stamp meant absolute finality. The federal marshals immediately stepped forward and placed heavy steel handcuffs around Bradley's wrists. The metallic clicking sound was incredibly loud in the quiet room. I remembered standing in my mother's home office, terrified that the local police were going to put those exact same handcuffs on me because of Bradley's vicious lies. Now the universe had balanced the scales with perfect poetic justice. As the marshals turned Bradley around to lead him out of the courtroom through the side door, his eyes desperately scanned the gallery. For one brief fleeting second, his gaze locked directly onto mine. I did not smile. I did not stand up and cheer. I did not cross my arms or project any kind of triumphant arrogance. I simply looked back at him with an expression of profound, quiet peace. I let him see that I was completely whole. I let him see that his cruelty had not broken me. I let him see that the sister he had always considered a small, weak fish was the one walking out of the courtroom entirely free while he was walking into a federal prison cell. Bradley's face crumbled into a mask of pure, absolute despair. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to speak, as if he wanted to beg for forgiveness one final time, but the marshals firmly pushed him forward and guided him through the heavy wooden door. The door closed solidly behind him, shutting him away from the world for the next 5 years. I sat in the quiet courtroom for a long moment, simply breathing in the cool, conditioned air. Attorney Sterling turned to me and offered a small, respectful nod. "It is completely over," Hannah, Sterling said quietly. "The law has worked exactly the way it is supposed to work. Your mother's brilliant plan was executed flawlessly." I nodded, feeling a deep, warm sense of closure settle over my entire soul. The nightmare was truly finally finished. I gathered my simple purse and stood up, walking down the center aisle of the courtroom with David right beside me. We walked out of the massive federal building and stepped onto the busy, bustling streets of Philadelphia. The sun was shining brightly overhead, casting a warm golden light across the city. I thought about my mother as I walked toward the train station. I thought about the incredible, fierce, brilliant love she had shown me. She had spent her final years quietly building an unbreakable fortress to protect my future from a predator she knew she could not change. She had known that the truth would eventually come to the surface. She had known that absolute greed is a blind, destructive force that always eventually consumes itself. I did not need to scream or fight or lower myself to Bradley's level of cruelty to find my justice. I simply needed to stand firm, hold onto the truth, and let the logical, methodical power of the law do exactly what it was designed to do. Bradley had built his own prison cell long before he ever stepped into that courtroom. He had built it with every lie, every forgery, and every selfish, arrogant choice he had ever made. I returned to my classroom the very next morning, ready to teach my students about the world. I felt a renewed sense of incredible purpose. I was no longer the exhausted, terrified woman hiding behind the privacy hedges of the main line. I was a strong, independent woman who had survived a massive storm. The legacy my mother had left me was not just the financial security of the irrevocable trust. The true inheritance she had given me was the absolute, undeniable knowledge of my own enduring strength. And nobody in the world would ever be able to take that away from me again. It has been exactly 6 long, transformative months since that heavy mahogany door closed on my brother Bradley at the upscale country club. 6 months since the terrifying, suffocating weight of potential homelessness and total financial ruin was finally lifted from my tired shoulders. The transition from absolute despair to complete, unshakable security was something I could barely comprehend at first. For 2 entire years, I had lived in a constant state of high alert, waiting for the next medical emergency, the next unpaid bill, the next cruel insult from my brother. Waking up in the morning without that heavy, tight knot of anxiety was sitting in the very center of my chest, felt like learning how to breathe a completely different type of air. I remember the exact Tuesday morning when David called me into his quiet accounting office for the final time regarding the formal settlement of the estate. The chaotic legal dust had finally settled. The federal authorities had completely dismantled Bradley's fraudulent corporate empire, and the irrevocable trust my mother had brilliantly designed to protect me was officially unsealed and legally transferred into my direct control. David turned his large computer monitor toward me, just like Attorney Sterling had done on that fateful afternoon in his law office. But this time I was not looking at a punitive clawback clause or a terrifyingly frozen bank account holding $0. I was looking at my brand new reality. The final verified number on the glowing screen was absolutely staggering. It was over $4 million. My mother had quietly, meticulously saved, invested, and fiercely protected a massive fortune, all while my brother was desperately and criminally trying to steal the leftover scraps. When I saw those zeros lined up on the banking ledger, I did not jump up and cheer. I did not scream with joy. I simply rested my face in my trembling hands and let out a long, quiet sigh of absolute profound peace. The money was not just currency to me. It was absolute, undeniable validation. It was physical, concrete proof of my mother's incredible, unconditional love and her absolute faith in my quiet strength. Everyone in society expects you to completely change your entire personality when you suddenly inherit millions of dollars overnight. The very few people who knew about the true nature of the federal settlement, like my building landlord, who had almost handed me an eviction notice, looked at me completely differently. They fully expected me to immediately pack up my small rented apartment, buy a massive sprawling stone mansion on the main line, purchase a fleet of shiny luxury cars, and disappear to a warm tropical island for the rest of my days. They expected me to behave exactly like Bradley and Chloe, but they simply did not understand that I had already seen exactly what unchecked greed and the obsessive, relentless pursuit of material luxury does to a human soul. I had watched it completely rot my older brother from the inside out, turning him into a monster who would willingly forge documents while his own mother lay dying. I had absolutely no desire to ever wear a heavy gold Rolex watch or drink vintage champagne on a Tuesday afternoon. Instead of quitting my job and abandoning my established life, I woke up the very next Monday morning, put on my comfortable, practical teaching shoes, and drove my dented 12-year-old Honda Civic straight to the public high school. Walking back into my familiar classroom felt like coming home after a terrible storm. The familiar, comforting smell of floor wax and old paperback textbooks was infinitely better than the sterile, artificial, vanilla-scented air of that exclusive country club. I stood at the front of the room, looking at the bright, anxious, hopeful faces of my history students, and I knew with absolute unshakable certainty that this was exactly where I belonged. I loved teaching with all of my heart. I loved showing these teenagers that human history is not just a boring collection of dates and old wars, but a long, continuous record of ordinary, everyday people standing up against arrogant tyrants and fighting relentlessly for the truth. Why would I ever walk away from a noble calling that gave my daily life so much deep, profound meaning and purpose? However, I also knew I could not just let my mother's massive hard-earned fortune sit completely idle in a digital bank account collecting dust. She had fought entirely too hard to protect it from my brother's greedy hands. She had built that federal trust fortress not just to destroy his criminal schemes, but to secure a future built on genuine, solid integrity. I deeply wanted to turn her quiet, brilliant legal victory into a permanent active force for good in the world. I sat down with David and Attorney Sterling once again, but this time the atmosphere in the law office was entirely different. We were no longer frantically planning a desperate defensive legal strike against a wealthy predator. We were carefully, thoughtfully designing a lasting legacy. I took a very large portion of the legal inheritance, over $2.5 million, and legally established a permanent charitable endowment. We officially named it the Susan Sterling Memorial Foundation. The core goal of the foundation was simple but incredibly powerful. I had spent years watching my most brilliant, hardworking public school students miss out on top-tier university educations simply because their families could not possibly afford the crushing massive tuition costs. I had watched my fellow dedicated teachers spend their own meager paychecks on basic essential classroom supplies, sacrificing their own personal financial security just to make sure their kids had fresh notebooks and sharpened pencils. The foundation was specifically designed to fix exactly that systemic brokenness. We created a comprehensive full-ride scholarship fund entirely dedicated to underprivileged high school students who demonstrated quiet, unyielding resilience. We were not looking for the loudest, flashiest, most popular kids in the room. We were actively searching for the students who worked long late-night shifts at fast food restaurants to support their younger siblings, the ones who studied diligently at tiny kitchen tables at 3 a.m, the ones who were completely routinely overlooked by the traditional academic system but possessed a fierce, unbreakable human spirit. Furthermore, we established a robust grant program to directly formally fund underpaid, dedicated public school teachers. We provided them with the direct financial resources they desperately needed to build their dream classrooms and pursue their educational passions without ever sacrificing their own livelihoods or going into debt. The very first foundation award ceremony was held in our high school gymnasium just last month. Standing on that small wooden stage, looking out at the crowd and handing a full ride, college scholarship check to a young girl who had grown up bouncing around the state foster care system, I felt my mother's warm, loving presence so strongly, it literally took my breath away. When the young girl hugged me tight, tears of pure joy streaming down her face, I knew without a single doubt that my mother was smiling down on us. Bradley had tried to use wealth as a cruel weapon to starve me, isolate me, and control my entire future. I was actively using that exact same wealth as a powerful tool to set innocent people completely free. That was the ultimate lasting triumph over his dark, suffocating greed. Going through a massive, horrific family trauma like this forces you to completely and permanently reevaluate everything you have ever been taught about family dynamics. Society constantly aggressively pushes the narrative that family is an absolute unbreakable holy bond. We are told from a very young age that we must unconditionally forgive the people who share our genetics, no matter how terribly or abusively they treat us behind closed doors. We are heavily conditioned to believe that keeping the superficial peace at tense holiday dinners is far more important than protecting our own personal, mental, and financial well-being. For 28 long years, I swallowed that toxic, dangerous narrative completely. I let my parents' subtle, everyday dismissals and my brother's overt, arrogant cruelty slowly, relentlessly chip away at my core self-worth, because I truly thought that was just what it meant to be a good, loyal, accommodating sister and daughter. I stayed perfectly quiet to avoid causing any family drama. But when I was forced to sit in that luxurious country club and watch my own flesh and blood brother try to legally steal my future and leave me completely homeless on the freezing street, the absolute blinding truth finally became crystal clear to me. Sharing the same blood does not give anyone the right to drain your lifeblood. Family is absolutely not defined by a shared last name or a matching genetic sequence. True, authentic family is defined by mutual respect, honest protection, and unconditional, uplifting support. Bradley completely and permanently voided his right to ever call himself my family the exact moment he selfishly forged our dying mother's signature while she lay trapped in a deep coma. He violently severed our sibling bond the very second he tried to extort me with my own stolen inheritance money. You do not owe your physical presence, your hard-earned resources, or your mental sanity to toxic, deeply manipulative people who only view you as a convenient stepping stone or a soft target for their own selfish financial gain. Many people in my community have asked me if I will ever find it in my heart to forgive him now that he is sitting alone in a cold federal prison cell serving a 5-year sentence. My answer is always the exact same. Forgiveness brings peace to your own soul, but justice is something you must fiercely fight for yourself. I have completely forgiven him for my own sake, to completely release the heavy, suffocating anger from my heart, so I can live my beautiful life in the warm light. But forgiving him internally does not mean I will ever allow him back into my personal life. It does not mean I will visit him or advocate for his early release from federal custody. The devastating consequences of his criminal actions belong entirely to him alone. I fought incredibly hard for my justice. I protected my personal boundaries, and I fully secured my lasting peace. That is the only resolution I will ever need in this lifetime. Now, as I sit in the quiet, comfortable safety of my own secure home, watching the beautiful golden sunset through my living room window, I want to turn this conversation over to you. I decided to share this deeply personal, painful journey because I know with absolute unwavering certainty that I'm not the only person who has walked this dark, lonely path. So many of us have been the quiet, dutiful sibling, the consistently overlooked child, the one who is always expected to carry the heavy emotional and physical burdens, while the golden child takes all the credit and effortlessly reaps all the rewards. So many of us have faced the heartbreaking, terrifying reality of a close family member choosing extreme financial greed over basic fundamental human decency. I want to hear from you directly and honestly. Have you ever been taken advantage of by a family member who tried to take what belonged to you? How did it make you feel to realize that the people who were supposed to protect you were actually the exact ones you needed fierce protection from? And most importantly, what did you do to protect your boundaries and fight for your own personal justice? Did you walk away from the toxicity? Did you take firm legal action? Did you find a way to completely rebuild your life on your own terms? Please take a moment to share your unique story in the comment section down below. Reading your shared experiences not only helps you process your own pain, but it creates a massive, powerful community of support for others who might be going through the exact same nightmare right now. Your voice matters, and your story absolutely deserves to be heard. If my journey resonated with you today, if it gave you even a small ounce of bright hope or the courage to finally stand up for yourself, please do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more incredible, true stories of truth and vindication. Finally, I always love to see exactly how far this amazing supportive community reaches. So please let me know which state or city you are watching this video in and exactly what time it is there right now. Bye and see you in the next story.